item. And when we do, Michelle will call the roll in alphabetical order. So no questions. I will call this meeting to order by taking attendance by roll. Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Chambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Lee. Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom.
Here.
Mousset.
Yes.
Bento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Thank you.
Great, we have a quorum. The first item is our agenda. Members can see the posted agenda. If there are no objections or changes, then we can move directly on to business. So any changes or to the agenda? Great, hearing none. The next item is approval of the minutes for December 7th, 2020 committee meeting. Do I have a motion to approve, please?
Wolf moves approval.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Bento seconds.
Thank you, Councilman. Any discussion, changes to the minutes? Discussion. Hearing none, Michelle, please call the roll on approval of the minutes.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Mousset.
Aye.
Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
That item is adopted, and we will move on to our first business item. It's the public hearing for the 2021 to 2030 Affordable and Life Cycle Housing Goals for communities re-enrolling in the Livable Communities Act and the Local Housing Incentives Account Program. And I'm sorry, Michelle or Lisa, was there a presentation before or a slide that was going to be showed before we moved into public comment?
It's being displayed right now.
Yep, I would say, Mr. Chair, this is Lisa Barajas, Community Development Director. We don't have a presentation for you today. We just have the slide for how the public can submit comments if they're unable to provide comments today.
So folks that have video can see the alternative ways of submitting comments. It's by mail. The address is listed, or I'm sure you can get the address on the website, or the public info at Met Council email address or phone as well. So thank you for putting that slide up. And and I know that we have Charlie Ardy here. So thanks for joining us today to consider comments related to the 2021-2030 Affordable Life Cycle Housing Goals adopted by communities choosing to re-enroll in the Livable Communities Act Local Housing Incentives Account. It's a voluntary program that allows participating communities to apply for grant support for brownfield cleanup, for the creation and preservation of affordable housing, the creation and preservation of living wage jobs, compact connected development, and transit-oriented development. The Livable Communities Act awards, on average, $20 million each year to participating communities, and participating communities can apply for Livable Communities Act grants in annual cycles, as outlined in our fund distribution plan that we adopt in the first quarter of each year. I'll end the public hearing when all commenters have been heard, and the Community Development Committee will continue its regularly scheduled business. You are welcome, visitors, to remain on the event and listen to the meeting. I know that we do, thanks, have one pre-registered visitor, so I'll recognize Charlie Vander D now for comment, please. You're welcome.
Thank you, Chair Lilligren and members of the committee. Good afternoon. I am Charlie Vanderarty with Metro Cities, which represents the collective interests of cities in the 7-county metropolitan region at the Metropolitan Council, the legislature, and the executive branch. Thank you for the opportunity to comment today. Metro Cities has long-standing policies that support the statutory goals and criteria for the Livable Communities Act, including tax-based revitalization, site investigation and cleanup, jobs, and economic development and affordable housing. Metro Cities has convened city officials multiple times over the history of the Livable Communities program to provide input to the council on the specific programs as well as in response to proposed changes. In 2018, we convened a work group to review Livable Communities at its 20-year anniversary, and earlier this year reconstituted that group to look at the next iteration of the fund distribution plan. A number of key priorities were consistently raised during those Livable Communities reviews and shared with the council at that time. Those included the program should remain accessible to all participating cities. City applications from across the metro, from the developing edge to outer ring and inner ring, as well as core cities, should be competitive for funding awards. And what is unique or innovative or provides demonstration value should be considered in the context of a city and its location and its amenities and development priorities. Today's topic, affordable and life cycle housing goals, are requirements for cities enrolling or re-enrolling in the Livable Communities program. 10 years ago, when the negotiated housing goals for LCA cities were last adopted, Metro Cities supported using a methodology that used the regional allocation of housing need as a baseline. Metro Cities continues to support a streamlined, flexible, consistent method for housing goals that recognizes the insufficiency in available resources for affordable and life cycle housing. While the item also includes a 10% increase on the lower end of the range, Metro Cities hopes the new addition by the council does not deter cities from enrolling or re-enrolling. Metro Cities believes that any LCA program policy should have at its core the goal of encouraging local participation in the Livable Communities program. Strong participation ensures progress on regional and local objectives, spurs additional affordable and life cycle housing production, and it moves innovative redevelopment and economic development projects forward and strengthens local tax bases. Thank you again, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to comment and share city's thoughts on the housing goals.
Thank you, Mr. Vanderdy, for your testimony and for the work that you do for our region. And I'm not sure, Michelle or Lisa, should I call, or is it only for pre-registered speakers today, or if there are other guests with us, do we take testimony from them?
Chair Lilligren, you can take comments from anybody in the audience that would wish to speak to this item.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Michelle. So at this point, I would ask, is there anyone else here who would like to make comments today on this item? Anyone? Anyone? Hearing none, I will remind folks that public comments will be accepted through 4:30 p.m. on December. Oh, that is not the right date. Hold on. I have an error in my notes.
Mr. Chair, my mistake. That should be January 4th, 5 p.m., as it says on our slide. That's my mistake on that one.
All right. Great. So, and then there are the ways that you can comment. Thank you for attending the public hearing, and we will now return to the regular business of the Community Development Committee. Next on the agenda is our consent agenda. The consent agenda consists of 2 items. It's the City of Inger Grove Heights Titan Land Comprehensive Plan Amendment, and also the City of Rosemont Emerald Isle Comprehensive Plan Amendment. And I would entertain a motion for approval.
Moved by Atlas Ingebretson.
Thanks, and welcome, Amir.
Johnson seconds.
Thank you, council members. Is there any discussion on the consent agenda? Hearing none, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebretson.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Bento,
Aye. Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That motion carries. And I'm just going to note, I think this is actually full attendance of the CDC tonight. So congratulations, us. Well done. Now moving on to the non-consent items. The first is 2020-340. It's a joint committee item and a same week item. It's the City of Fridley's 2040 Comprehensive Plan and Comprehensive Sewer Plan. And Ms. Raya Smalley is here to present. Welcome, Ms. Smalley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, okay, perfect. I'm Raya Smiley. I'm the second representative for District 4 in the Local Planning Assistance Group and Community Development Division, and I'm presenting City of Fridley's comprehensive plan on behalf of my colleague Eric Wycheck today. I'd like to let the committee know that, I was just going through the list of attendees, but I believe that Stacy Stromberg, the City of Fridley's planning manager, should be in audience today, and so is Rita Trapp, associate at HKGI, is also on this call as a planning consultant. Eric wanted me to extend his thanks to the City of Fridley for all of their hard work and dedication on their 2040 plan. And before you today is the review of the City of Fridley's 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. This map reflects Figure 1 of the staff report, and it identifies the location of regional system components within the City of Fridley. Next slide, please. Figure 2 from the staff report identifies the city as urban community designation, consistent with Thrive MSP 2040, and Fridley is located in southern Anoka County. Next slide, please. Table 1, which is also in your staff report, shows that between 2020 and 2040, the council forecasts that the city will grow by 3,200 people, representing 1,400 households, and there will be an increase of 2,400 jobs in the city in the same time frame. Next slide, please. Table 2 from the staff report, also shown here, shows that the planned residential density in the urban areas of the city the overall density for guided residential land is expected to be between 10.4 and 37 units per acre. Communities with an urban designation under Thrive are expected to plan for forecasted population and household growth at overall average minimum densities of 10 units per acre for new development and redevelopment, and Fridley's plan is consistent with this policy. Next slide, please. Thank you. The city's existing land use map refers to Figure 3 of the staff report. The existing land uses in Fridley are predominantly residential, and given the city's major highway and freight corridors, Fridley has a high proportion of industrial land, and it has performed extensive planning work over the last few years to reconnect the disparate parts of the city through transportation and bicycle and pedestrian initiatives. Next slide, please. Thank you. The city's future land use map refers to Figure 4 of your staff report. The future land uses include some special planning areas that require higher densities. For instance, Table 2, shown previously, shows the Georgetown apartments and the City Hall campus sites as carrying higher multifamily residential density ranges. And the city chose this option in the plan to target certain areas for more intense specified development. The plan recognizes the existing transitway, North Star, Fridley Commuter Rail Station. The plan also recognizes the high-frequency bus route 10, which runs along Central University Avenues. Both of these transit routes are part of the current revenue scenario of the TPP, and the city plans for densities near transit, which are consistent with policies in the TPP. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the council proposed findings are that the plan conforms to metropolitan system plans, is consistent with council policies, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent local governmental units and affected jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Thank you. The Tuesday, December 22nd Environment Committee, so that's tomorrow, has been canceled, and the proposed action will be forwarded directly to the council meeting on December 23rd for final action. So this item will be on the Metropolitan Council's agenda on December 23rd meeting. And I just want to remind the committee that Stacy Stromberg and the city of Fridley's planning manager and Rita Trapp, the city's planning consultant, are in the audience today. Next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry, can you go back one slide? Thank you. So the council staff proposed the following actions: that the council authorized the city of Fridley to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, that the local water management plan needs to be incorporated into the formal plan as either a freestanding chapter or appendix when the city submits the final plan to the council. The city also needs to send the council the date that the city adopts the final local water management plan. Next slide, please. And advise the city to incorporate the local water management plan into the formal plan as, this is similar to the previous one, as either a freestanding chapter or appendix, adopt the Mississippi River Critical Corridor Area or MERCA plan within 60 days after receiving final DNR approval, and submit a copy of the final adopted plan and evidence of adoption to the DNR, Council, and National Park Service within 10 days after the adoption, and implement the advisory comments in the review record for forecast, land use, and water supply. And next slide, please. Okay, with that, I am happy to answer any questions you may have, or at least I'll try.
Thanks, Mrs. Smalley. Appreciate your stepping in, and thanks to Ms. Stromberg and Ms. Trapp for attending tonight and for your partnership here. Any questions on that report, committee members? Questions?
Councilmember Lindstrom is waiting.
Yes. Councilmember Lindstrom, thank you. What? Okay. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And not a question, but just a comment that Fridley is going to be a great center of attention from the Met Council Environmental Services in the years ahead. Fridley is going to be the home to a brand new lift station. It's moving across the river from Brooklyn Center to Fridley, right along the river, and this is going to be a very large construction project. So I just wanted to reiterate what I said at the public hearing the other day to Ms. Stromberg and Ms. Trapp, that obviously there's going to be some neighbors impact in terms of the construction and whatnot, and certainly some neighborhood concerns about a lift station. And as you think about outreach on this project, please keep us in mind, keep me in mind in terms of being able to show up to any sort of community meetings, or just the Met Council representative from the area, or staff, or whatever you folks need in terms of communication with the residents. Let's have a good back and forth on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Robert?
Yep. Thank you, Councilmember. Yeah, again,
I know sometimes it's hard
my
to see
WebEx
folks.
is really sluggish. And so is that you, Councilmember Chambliss?
Yes, this is Councilmember
Please.
Chambliss. District 2, Fridley is my district as well. And I'm really glad to see what's proposed and to see the diversity of Fridley as evidenced by this comprehensive plan. A lot of redevelopment plan for this area, which is very mature. As Peter, Councilmember Lindstrom stated, there is some improvements that are happening in the Brooklyn Park area and crossing over to a new lift station for Fridley. So we're excited about that project. And we're also excited that Fridley is part of the proposal and research for our BRT projects along Central Avenue. And I will also say that if you have any events that you want me to come to, I will be available for that, and looking forward to meeting with staff soon.
Thank you, Councilmember Chambliss. And I'm not seeing anyone else requesting to speak. So, Councilmember Chambliss, can we take that as a motion to approve?
Yes, I'll make a motion to approve.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second by Lindstrom.
Thank you, Councilmember Lindstrom. And any discussion on the motion? Discussion. Seeing none, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen,
Aye.
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Lilligren,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Ento,
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That motion carries. And again, thanks to our guests from Fridley for being here and for your work on this. Next, we'll move on to our 2020-341, another joint committee item, same week item as well. It's the City of White Bear Lake 2040 Comprehensive Plan and Comprehensive Sewer Plan, and we'll continue with Mrs. Smiley on this. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Raya Smiley again, still District 4 Sector Rep in Local Planning Assistance and Community Development. I would like to let you know that Ann Kane, the City of White Bear Lakes Community Development Director, is in attendance. So is Rita Trapp still in attendance, who was the planning consultant for the City of White Bear Lakes plan as well. And I want to extend my personal thanks to Ann and everyone else at the city working so diligently with us on this plan and getting it to completeness in honestly record time. So thank you. Before you today is the review of the City of White Bear Lakes 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Next slide, please. This map reflects Figure 1 of the staff report and identifies the location of regional system components within the City of White Bear Lake. Next slide, please. Figure 2 of the staff report identifies the city's community designation in Thrive as suburban, and White Bear Lake is located in the northeastern corner of Ramsey County. Next slide, please. Table 1 in your staff report shows that between 2020 and 2040, the council forecasts that the city will grow by 1,500 people, representing 1,200 households, and there will be an increase of 500 jobs in the city in the same time frame. Next slide, please. Table 2 from the staff report shows us a change in sewer service forecast to reflect the expectation that all of the city is served before 2030, and that's what's identified as underlined in this table. Next slide, please. Table 3 from the staff report on page 11 shown here illustrates the planned residential density in the City of White Bear Lake. The overall density of guided residential land is expected to be between 8.4 and 18.3 units per acre. And communities with a suburban designation in Thrive are expected to plan for forecasted population and household growth for new development and redevelopment at overall average minimum densities of 5 units per acre. And White Bear Lake's plan is consistent with this policy. Next slide, please. The city's existing land use map refers to Figure 3 of the staff report. The existing land uses in the city are predominantly residential, and most of the existing commercial and industrial areas are located near main transportation corridors such as Interstate 35E and US Highway 61. Next slide, please. The city's future land use map refers to Figure 4 of the staff report. the plan maintains mostly single-family residential characteristics while encouraging higher residential density and a mix of uses along the main transportation corridors. The plan also adds new categories such as arts and culture mixed use, TOD mixed use, and neighborhood mixed use, and provides a range of densities in order to provide more flexibility for future transit investments. And it's noteworthy to say that the rush line will be going through the city. However, at the time of the issuance of the system statements, the rush line was part of the increased revenue scenario of the TPP and therefore not quite 100% included. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, the proposed findings are that the plan conforms to the Metropolitan System Plans, is consistent with council policies with changes to sewer service forecasts, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent local governmental units and affected jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Similar to the City of Fridley's plan, for the City of White Bear Lake's 2040 plan, the Tuesday Environment Committee tomorrow has been canceled, and the proposed actions will go directly forwarded, well, will be directly forwarded to the council for its meeting on Wednesday, December 23rd. Next slide, please. So actually, before I read the actions, I do want to remind the committee that Ann Kane, the city's community development director, and Rita Trapp, the planning consultant, are both in attendance. So the proposed actions before you are to authorize the City of White Bear Lake to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, revise the city's sewer service forecast upward as shown in Table 2, advise the city that the NPCA reissued the MS4 general permit to the city on November 16, 2020. The city's stormwater pollution prevention program and the surface water management plan need to be reviewed to determine if any changes are needed to meet the conditions of the reissued permit. And the city's adopted engineering design standards for stormwater management, or a summary of them, need to be included in the surface water management plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. The city needs to add the projects listed in the 5-year, the 2019 to 2023 Capital Improvement Program, or CIP, under the heading Surface Water Fund, as well as the highest priority implementation actions for the subsequent 5 years to the Surface Water Management Plan to form the CIP required by Minnesota rules. And the recommended actions as fully described within this report for the Surface Water Management Plan must be complete prior to final 2040 plan submittal to the council. And finally, advise the city to implement the advisory comments in the review record for forecast, land use, and water supply. Next slide, please. With that, I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Smiley, for that report and for your work on it. And I also want to thank Ms. Kane and Ms. Trapp for being here tonight and for their partnership. Questions on that report, committee members? Any questions or discussion? Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to begin by adding my thanks to Ann and Rita as well. White Bear Lake is a part of District 11. I have spent much of the last year and a half or so figuring out the boundaries between White Bear Lake and White Bear Township, and I think I've kind of got it down. But regardless of where you go in this corner of the Twin Cities, you're going to find a lot of really remarkable places. And I want to note that although this isn't a part of city government, it is very much a part of the community in White Bear. The Arts Center and the History Center both add a lot of character to the community and are a tremendous resource for all White Bear residents and all of us in the metro area, regardless of age. It's just fabulous. So, Ann, Rita, to Mayor Emerson and to the City Council and all of the city staff, thank you and congratulations. I will move approval of the comprehensive plan for White Bear Lake.
Second by Lee.
Chair, you're on mute.
I was sorry about that. I was saying such nice things too. So thank you, council members, for the motion and the second. And again, thanks for our visitors here from White Lake for your attendance and your partnership. And hearing no further discussion on the motion, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen,
Aye.
Ambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Lilligren,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Mento,
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Great. That item is adopted. Thanks, Michelle. We'll move on to our next item is 2020-328. It's the Sam Morgan Regional Trail Master Plan Amendment for the City of St. Paul, and we have Mr. Kelly here to present. Welcome, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you great, Colin.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon once again to Mr. Chair and our council members. I am Colin Kelly, Regional Parks Planning Analyst, and I'm here to present the Samuel Morgan Regional Trail Master Plan Amendment on behalf of the City of St. Paul. Next slide, please. The Samuel Morgan Regional Trail is located near the center of the regional park system in the City of St. Paul. These are figures 1 through 3 in the staff report. The 5.9-mile trail provides a continuous bicycle and pedestrian connection between Crosby Farm Regional Park to the west and Battle Creek Regional Park to the east, almost all of it along the Mississippi River. The current plan amendment is the result of a planning process performed in 2017 and 2018 to renovate the 21.4 acres of regional trail corridor land that is Lower Landing. This segment of the trail is only about 0.6 of a mile in length, but it is much wider than a typical regional trail corridor in the middle, especially, presenting an opportunity to provide secondary recreational uses that complement the primary trail use. Since the plan amendment proposes such uses, it addresses the requirements of Chapter 7 in the Regional Parks Policy Plan. The City of St. Paul has also provided a memo that includes more information on these secondary recreational uses, which is included in the staff report as Attachment 1. The secondary recreational opportunities are intended to strengthen equitable use of the regional trail corridor by all residents of the region and the local area. Next slide, please. Community and partner engagement was critical in developing recommendations for the regional trail corridor, and many different people were involved, including residents of Dayton's Bluff and downtown neighborhoods, the city's Capitol River Council, Lower Phelan Creek Project, the Capitol River Watershed District, Ramsey County, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, and others. Through a variety of engagement opportunities, participants noted that new activities and enhanced safety measures would encourage more use of the regional trail corridor. Community members also suggested adding natural surface trails and sitting areas to appreciate river views and nature. In addition, the design team and Lower Phelan Creek Project discussed using the eastern portion of the regional trail corridor as a natural transition space to the sacred Wakan Teepee site and Indian Mounds burial site. This space would be designed to acknowledge the significance of the area to the Dakota people through the use of signage, public art, and interpretation. Providing environmental education opportunities was also discussed. The graphic on the right of your slide is Figure 6 in the staff report, and it highlights some of the demographic characteristics of 4 neighborhoods near the regional trail corridor. One of the findings is that there are many households with children in Upper East downtown, and many of these residents are of East African background. Also, adjacent neighborhoods are primarily made up of low-income families with low mobility and limited recreation options. Through the public engagement process, city staff learned that many residents have not used the regional trail or Lower Landing due to lack of awareness or due to safety concerns. They also learned that there is demand for active recreation opportunities to serve youth. Next slide, please. All new facilities in Lower Landing and the Regional Trail Corridor will be developed in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. Based on the results of community input and the assessment of site conditions, opportunities, and constraints, 3 main goals were identified to guide site organization and programming. First, integrate the regional trail with the adjacent context spatially and socially to improve and provide connections to the adjacent and age-diverse communities. Second, activate the regional trail corridor through the addition of trail-oriented activities while respecting and keeping the existing tranquil natural settings along the river corridor. Third, reveal the inherent history of the area by taking advantage of the location of the trail alignment and its connection to relevant historic sites and the river. The graphic on the lower right-hand side is Figure 4 in the staff report. Getting a bit more specific, 4 projects were identified as priorities to start activating Lower Landing to make it more welcoming and accessible. They include access and park entryway plaza improvement. Second, parking lot expansion. Third, the addition of a natural surface trail. And fourth, an off-leash dog area. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the plan proposes some non-traditional recreational activities. Among other amenities, the plan proposes adding pickup game space for futsal and half basketball courts, a pump track or bike skills course, and the improvement of open multi-purpose lawns for community events, the creators game, also known as native lacrosse, or other uses. Pickup game courts would fulfill the need for active recreational amenities, recommended through community engagement activities. Futsal, a fast-moving version of soccer on a smaller pitch, and basketball are 2 of the most popular activities that agency staff see young people playing in parks without adequate facilities. These activities are inclusive social games for all genders, races, ages, and abilities. Rain gardens and bioswales would be added to collect stormwater from the courts. The plan also recommends developing a pump track or bike skills course, which could be integrated into the existing landscape with relatively close access to the existing regional trail. Of course, in this space, floodplain design requirements would be taken into consideration. In addition, the plan recommends open multi-purpose lawns for a variety of activities, including to support community events and an interpretive or educational area to learn about and play the creators game. Implementing a native lacrosse field was suggested by members of the Native American community who live in the Dayton's Bluff neighborhood. Using the space in this way would provide an opportunity to share the significance of the game and its cultural connection with the indigenous community. As mentioned, because the plan proposes new or non-traditional uses, it addresses the requirements of Chapter 7 in the Regional Parks Policy Plan. These recreational activities are directly linked to community engagement efforts and the equity analysis, and are intended to strengthen equitable use of the trail corridor by all residents of the region and local area. Next slide, please. The estimated project costs. Since all of the land within the trail corridor is already in public ownership, no acquisition costs are anticipated and no land acquisition is necessary. Development cost estimates, which total approximately $9,260,000, include resurfacing the trail, replacing lighting, adding wayfinding signage, adding interpretive resting nodes, improving the multi-use lawns, adding a pump track, adding half basketball and futsal courts, planting trees and prairie species, and restoring wetlands. I should note, as always, that approval of this master plan amendment does not commit the council to any funding at this time. Next slide, please. The Samuel Morgan Regional Trail Corridor Master Plan Amendment is consistent with the requirements of the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan, including Planning Strategy 1, Recreation Activities and Facilities Strategies 1 through 3, and other council policies such as those found in Thrive MSP 2040. Slide, please. The proposed action before you, then, is that the Metropolitan Council, 1, approve the City of St. Paul Samuel Morgan Regional Trail Corridor Master Plan Amendment, including the supplemental information provided in the memo dated October 26, 2020, And number 2, require the City of St. Paul, prior to initiating any new development of the Regional Trail Corridor, to send preliminary plans to the Environmental Services Assistant Manager at the Met Council's Environmental Services Division. I should note that the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission voted unanimously to approve the proposed action at their meeting on December 3rd. And with that, I stand for any comments or questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for that report and for your work on this. And I would ask for any questions or discussions on that report, please.
Chair Lilligren, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen has her hand raised.
Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to also share the commissioners had really strong support for this plan, and as you know, it was unanimously supported. But this is the first time we've talked about an indigenous game in the time I've been on the council, the Creators Game, and having a pitcher or court field for that, which is really exciting, and particularly in this location. And again, another great example of us having implementing agencies and working in partnership to have what the community engagement has yielded come out and come into life in a plan and a community engagement process that was inclusive of voices often left out of our processes. So just wanted to share that bit of background on conversation and also highlight the uniqueness of this plan. Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for your presentation, and really excited to be able to vote for this today. I would move for a vote.
Cool. And I will come back to you, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, and there may be some other questions and discussion just before we get to the vote. Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to share a little history here. As I was preparing for the meeting today, I kept thinking, I know something about Sam Morgan. What is it? And so I started digging around. He was a native of Duluth, Minnesota. He grew up in St. Paul. In the early 1960s, he was invited by a friend to attend a community meeting regarding the development of a park and a trail. And as a result, he became very active in the community as an advocate for parks and trails. His leadership resulted in the Fort Snelling State Park, the Lilydale Regional Park, the Afton State Park, and the Gateway State Trail. In 2000, let me look here, in May of 2000, he received the Met Council's Metropolitan Regional Leadership Award for his leadership in his work advancing environmental vision. So I wanted to share that because those names are important, and what he did was important, and we need more Sam Morgans and Samantha Morgans out there doing the work. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any questions on the report? Otherwise, we will move to a motion.
Chair,
Councilmember
Mr.
Wolf.
Chair. Yes, thank you. This is Councilmember Wolf. And I agree, it's a really cool plan. I have the same concerns about this plan, however, as I did with the Minneapolis one. Once again, we have a parks agency that is both a local parks agency and a regional parks agency. And in the past, when you wanted to put something that is more traditionally a city park amenity, such as the basketball courts and the futsal courts, we would just basically draw a line around that and say that's not eligible for regional park funding, but go ahead and do it. You can have a city park kind of part of the regional park. I'm still concerned that we're not doing this here, because it sets up that for every trail that we do, a local community can say, we want city park features there to get people to use the trail, and we'll end up paying for city parks all over the region. So maybe Linnea could talk about whether they talked about that in the meeting, or if somebody else wants to comment.
Thank you, Councilmember. So I'll first ask Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, or maybe turn to staff. I appreciate your consistency. I figured you'd be speaking up during this item. So
Yeah,
thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thanks, Chair and Councilmember Wolf. I would actually ask that staff comment, but that I will just share in the context of our meeting. This was something that had great support across the commissions. I think that this is a place where we are seeing a change in approach. And so I would welcome Emmett or Mr. Mullen or Mr. Kelly, who I think Mr. Mullen is also on the call still.
Yes, he is. So I turn to either Mr. Kelly or Mr. Mullen, who would like to respond.
Mr. Chair, it's Mr.
Yes.
Kelly here. I could certainly jump in. The master plan that Councilmember Wolf was referring to was the Shingle Creek Regional Trail Master Plan in Minneapolis, and like the Samuel Morgan Regional Trail Corridor Master Plan, there are some wider sections of that trail that present opportunities to develop some secondary activities potentially in those spaces. And again, as Councilmember Wolf said, these spaces are integrated into our urban centers and themselves are municipally operated, if you will, with the city of St. Paul and Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. And so sometimes you have these hybrids almost between, these local parks and regional parks, and you're getting more and more these days proposals for things that seem more local park-like or appropriate in these regional trail corridors with these widenings. But really, I think what we're seeing, and as Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen alluded to, really the implementation of our equity analysis requirement, where there's a direct link between our community engagement and the equity analysis and the development concepts that are coming out of that. And so I'll leave it at that, and also offer to Mr. Mullen, if he's available, to add to that, if he would so choose.
Yeah, thanks. I saw Emmett did go on camera and unmute, so I assume Mr. Mullen does want to say something. Mr. Mullen.
Chair Lilligren and members of the committee, I just wanted to acknowledge that thank you for the question, Councilmember Wolf. You've consistently raised this question and issue. St. Paul is an implementing agency that does manage a local park system and a regional park system. And Councilmembers Wolf and Atlas Ingebrigtsen acknowledge that this is the regional system, which is largely a nature-based system. I just wanted to reiterate one thing that Colin Kelly said, which was we are really trying to listen to the communities during the public engagement process, and particularly when it comes to regional trails, because we're really interested in ensuring that these regional trails reflect the population of the region. One thing that we've discovered the last time we did the visitor survey was that our regional trails were challenged. They didn't represent, the use on our trails didn't represent the regional population. That's bringing us to a place where we are evolving as a system. And while I think that some of these activities, you can find the creator's game in local parks, but this is going to be an open, flexible field. This is something that we think will be a real amenity. The futsal courts and the basketball courts will largely be located, I think it's either underneath or right next to where Highway 52 goes across this park. And so they're largely impervious areas to begin with. We think that there will be a nice, attractive amenity that will really bring people who live downtown into the regional system. And not only can they enjoy those activities, but then they can move into the more passive recreational spaces like walking along the river or nature observation or whatnot. So that's all I wanted to add. And I wanted to thank Councilmember Wolf for her consistency and her good questions, as well as Councilmember Atlas Engelbrettson's point that this was something that we discussed in detail at the commission, and it's something that ultimately was supported.
Can I follow up, Mr. Chair?
Mullen. Yeah, please, Councilmember Wolf.
So if any other park, say Maple Grove, Three Rivers, decides they want to put in basketball courts, they have a public engagement and people say they want basketball courts, is that what we're doing all over the system now, or is it only in Minneapolis and St. Paul parks that we're doing that?
Thanks, Councilman. I think I turn to Mr. Mullen for a response, please.
Councilmember Wolf, if an amenity such as a half basketball court came up in a Three Rivers Park District, that's something that they want, I think that would be ultimately the commission and council's decision. But my guess is that yes, we would support it. And why? Because we think that it's a game that really a lot of younger or older children and young adults really enjoy. This is something that you can put right next to a picnic shelter or a playground area. It doesn't really add hardly any impervious surface, and it brings a different it attracts a different cadre of people that we don't think are participating at the same levels as the rest of the population. So long answer, excuse me. Thanks.
Councilmember Wolf? Anything else?
I'm done, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Chambliss.
I just wanted to say that I appreciate all the questions and the conversation, the presentation and the plans. Sound wonderful. It's going to be not only serving the communities, but introducing to the broader community some new games and new activities, new ways of interacting. And I really like the approach to, the change in the approach to having more emphasis on engagement, as well as moving people from the cities to our regional parks and trails and back. I remember when I first got to the council, I talked about exposure and how important that is. It's important on both sides. Once people are exposed to more outdoor activities and different activities in the more urban areas, they're more likely to participate in the regional areas. So bravo to everyone that's worked on this.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as it's raised, it's a bit of a policy question, and I'm sorry if I missed this in the past, but do we have it delineated what are, more of the regional park amenities versus the city park amenities? Are there lists available? Because as we were sitting here, I actually did go to French Park, their site, and where it went. And as I just look at the opportunities that we have here, certainly because it's on Medicine Lake, there's boating, biking, cross-country skiing on the trails, dog trails, fishing, hiking, paddling, picnic areas, play sets, sledding, snowshoeing, and swimming. And I can tell you the city offers all of that too, because the city has two parks on the lake, and even off the lake, we offer a lot of those opportunities on the trails. So I'm just trying to figure out, not for right this moment, but just as a policy question, was it delineated or suggested at one time, kind of this division, so that we're not, starting to pick up costs for each other? The only other thing I would say, again, in a couple decades worth of service and population changing and young people coming in and new interests and, ways to enjoy the outdoors and the indoors too. We've at the city level have had to change a lot of things to adapt to what people really want, including the aging of our population. So, and the schools have had to as well. And, a lot of times we work and share amenities, but, in my community, if you're talking basketball space, indoor, outdoor, ice time, indoor, outdoor, I mean, there's just never enough. The community can't get enough of it. So, with all of these activities, I guess, I'd like to just understand the policy decision if there is one. And if there isn't one, I think, it's good to, have this discussion, but I think at some time we need to maybe loosely say, or in general say, this is the direction we're going in, because it's encouraging new participation or expanded participation in the park system, whether it be the local level, the regional level, the state level. Because if they're in one park finding ways to enjoy it, they'll be maybe in another park one day finding ways to enjoy it and finding new experiences that they are less familiar with. So I'm done talking, and it doesn't need to be answered tonight, but just a little bit of history so I understand. Because, I mean, at the face of it, I get it, right? Who's paying for what, and are we doubling up, and is one going to get it and the others aren't? I get that. So at some point, I'd like to just learn more is all I'm saying.
Great. Thanks, Councilmember. I see Councilmember Alice Ingerbretson requesting to speak. Is that in response to Councilmember Johnson's question, Linnea?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then we may want to turn to staff if we need further clarification. Councilmember Alice Ingerbretson.
Yeah, I just want to highlight it that Councilmember Johnson, I really appreciate your acknowledgement that a lot of services that are in regional parks, we also provide in local parks and vice versa. And that's a great and powerful observation to make. I think, and I appreciate that the intent is all around stewardship and stewardship of our funds and stewardship of the process that's been in place. And I appreciate that. We're solving for a problem. We're solving for an institutionalized inequity that is present throughout our systems. And I want to remind people, regional parks are urban, regional parks are suburban, regional parks are exurban. So regional parks are not urban versus those other things. They exist in our urban core. They exist in our exurban, more rural communities. And there was a challenge. There's still a challenge that we all talk and hear about, whether it's no child left inside or it is the issue that we need to have all people participating in our natural resources, one, because of their health, two, because of the well-being of our communities and our society, and three, if they aren't a part of it, their willingness to be stewards financially contribute to conservation and other things will be greatly harmed. For that reason, over 10 years ago, agencies like Met Council, like the state, like local parks started and have been talking about equity, which if you think about our equity work at the council, the place where we are most advanced in our equity work really is in the park space. If you think we have dedicated funds, we have assessments that we do, we've been partnering with the implementing agencies and the public for years at the Met Council around this work, all to change the process so that we have systems that better reflect the population that, one, is a part of our community, but two, has been historically left out of our systems. These are the bridging systems. That is the intent behind that and the intent about changing some of our practices. So Councilmember Johnson, to that question is there a list that's in and out? Historically, yeah. We are working to change that. So we are more flexible, more equitable, able to be more responsive to the unique opportunities and needs that communities have by implementing agency, by geography, and by the opportunities that by harnessing the richness of our cultural diversity, like bringing the Creators Game in to one of our regional facilities, we can not just make sure that a population whose land we are on is included in our spaces, but also introduce wonderful things of their culture to those who inhabit the land with them today.
Thank you, Councilmember. And then I didn't know if Mr. Mullen, Mr. Kelly, if you wanted to respond to sort of the policy side of Councilmember Johnson's question or not.
Chair Lilligren, I would be happy to respond and just say Chapter 6 in the Regional Parks Policy Plan is the recreational Activities and Facilities chapter. And yes, it's exactly what Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen said. There is a list. And secondly, we recognize, and we've introduced attention into that list that says we recognize that this is the traditional list and that we need to continue and carefully evolve and grow as we expand this list to new activities that are really things that people want to do and that aren't what we did yesterday, but what we need to do tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you. And it looked like Mr. Kelly was holding up 7. I assume that meant chapter 7 rather than chapter 6, Mr. Kelly. Is that what you were?
Indeed. Just a friendly revision to the information. Yeah, we've got a nice list on page 100 of the Regional Parks Policy Plan. So check it out. It is a list that is not all inclusive, and there are many activities in the regional park system today that are not on this list. So we will continue the discussion in months and years ahead, no doubt.
Thank you. Further discussion on this report? Is that Councilmember Wolf? Are you raising your hand? Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I totally get the need for the changing activities. It's more of a being consistent throughout the system, a geographic equity that there are many places in the regional trail system that go next to or through city parks and could have a very similar setup with those sorts of things, but they're paid for by the city taxpayers rather than the regional park system. And we've also had some major trail corridor acquisitions that have been wider than what is needed for the trail because you couldn't get the trail easement without taking the whole house, kind of a thing. So you're looking at in the future the possibility of master plans all over the system where those, it could be 5, 10, who knows how many acres along a trail corridor that we could end up putting in basically local parks for different neighborhoods all over the region. So I'm just trying to be consistent throughout the region. I have nothing against any of the activities. Just to me, it was always cleaner when you're going to do city stuff in the regional park to delineate it that way so that you're keeping the rest of the region the same and treating everybody the same rather than having different rules in different parks where some of them get to count city activities like fields. And I was not referring to the creators game. I was referring to the actual fields. It is a policy difference, and it sounds like something that could be interpreted differently depending on where you are in the region. And I'm just trying to be consistent on how we treat all of our agencies.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I'll just remind us all that this in no way commits us to future funding, but when something's in a plan, it has a certain reality around it that it doesn't, if it's not in a plan. So we do get another bite at the apple, I guess, before funding would go out the door. Any other discussion? Seeing none, I would turn to Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen for a motion, please.
I move to approve.
Second by Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Lee. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion? Seeing none, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Musset.
Aye.
Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
That item is adopted. Thank you, council members. Next, we will move on to item 2020-344. That's the Livable Communities Act Tax-Based Revitalization Account Grant Recommendations. And we have Mr. Martin here to present. Mr. Martin, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the committee, for putting this item on your agenda today. I am Marcus Martin. I am here to present the tax-based revitalization account grant recommendations. I'll start with some background. Next slide, please. As you are very familiar, the program is intended to, the purpose rather, is to help clean up contamination for redevelopment projects that will improve the tax base and add jobs or affordable housing units to communities that participate in the Livable Communities Act. The program is also expected to provide the highest public benefits for costs incurred and consider joint funding from other partners. Next slide, please. In our second call for applications in 2020, it was in August. We received 23 applications for projects located in Bloomington, Falcon Heights, Hopkins, Minneapolis, St. Louis Park, St. Paul, and South St. Paul. Of those 23, 5 were in the seed category, 3 were investigations, and 14 were cleanup requests. Next slide, please. We offered $3 million and received almost $6 million in funding requests this cycle. The account is oversubscribed, and this is an important consideration for imposing funding limits, as we'll see shortly. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the seed recommendations. The following 5 seed projects are recommended for TBRA funding. The highest scoring projects are listed first. All right. Baldwin Square, $107,800. The Resolute, $37,200. 1650 White Bear Ave, $41,400. 1517 West Broadway Incubator, $35,600, and the link on 21st, $38,200. Next slide, please. Next, we'll go to the investigation. The following 3 investigation projects are recommended for funding. Northrop King, $50,000. Beltline Boulevard Station, $50,000, and 678 North Snelling Avenue, $10,000. Next slide. The following 6 cleanup projects are recommended for TBRA funding. Grants are recommended for Curry Commons, $480,300. Vista 44, $172,300. Elliott Twins, $233,600. 2025 West River Road, $517,100. Lindale Flats, $264,100. And Amber Union, $960,200. 62,200, excuse me. By statute, we are required to consider funding from other sources, as I said at the beginning. Recommendations for the funding partners at DEED were finalized after the staff report was completed and released on Friday. Hennepin County is nearly complete. So I want to point out that additional funding is recommended for Vista 44 above the request, and that allows us to work together to clean up the most projects possible while still meeting the priorities of each of the funding partner organizations. The recommended funding amounts were also affected by the statutory funding limits. Next slide, please. When there is a higher demand for the funds than the amount of funds that are available, by statute, we can offer a 50%, or award rather, 50% to a single community, and up to 75% of the funding could go to Minneapolis or St. Paul. Next slide. The amount recommended for the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul in this funding cycle is 52% of the total available, well below the 75% maximum. Thus, this statutory limit has been met. Next slide. The amount recommended for projects in the city of Minneapolis is 1.5 million, and that adds up to 50% of the total funding available. So the single city statutory limit has also been met. Next slide. So let's take a look at the projects that are not recommended for funding. It was a competitive funding cycle, as they often are. 8 cleanup projects are not recommended for funding, and one of the projects was not eligible for funding. So there's a lot on here, but let's starting on the projects on your left. Although the Lake Street housing phase 2 scored high enough in the evaluation to be recommended for funding, we expect that there will be enough funding to cover the documented cleanup costs from other sources. They did get a grant with a higher request than we originally asked for and from DEED. And the remaining 3 projects also scored high enough to be considered for funding, but are not recommended by staff because we reached that funding limit for the city of Minneapolis that we just talked about. In the case of the Blake Station, the project didn't quite have enough cleanup costs to demonstrate a need for the cleanup funding relative to the total development cost. Looking at the list of projects on the right, 4 of the projects not recommended for funding didn't meet our required minimum score. According to the grant criteria in the fund distribution plan, the cleanup projects must have a score of 70 out of 140 points to be recommended for funding by staff. And in this case, what happened is most of these projects, if you think of it as tiers, low, medium, and high, these projects had mostly medium or low scores, with one exception being the phase 2 Snelling project, the Snelling Yard Senior Housing Project, rather, phase 1 of that, I should say. So those are some of the reasons that you can see why we didn't fund those or recommend. Next slide, please. Shown here are the cumulative expected benefits to the region if the staff recommendation is approved. After redevelopment, gains are expected in the annual tax base, in jobs, affordable housing units, including affordable units, and in commercial space. Next slide, please. In closing, the staff recommendation to this committee, as listed in the business item, is that the Metropolitan Council award 14 tax base revitalization account grants, as shown in Table 1 in the business item, and second, authorize its Community Development Division Director to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the Council. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Any questions on that report? Questions? I'm not hearing anyone, but my connection's kind of bad. So if I'm missing some, please let me know.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, quick question.
Yeah, please.
And maybe Councilmember Lindstrom is the expert on this, but the project in Falcon Heights, what is that project? I mean, it's a large amount. I'm not opposed to it. I'm just curious. Is it I'm like in my head, I kind of grew up over there, but like, what is that?
Yes,
Councilmember Lindstrom, did you want to respond?
Sure, I can pipe in on that one. This is about a block and a half from my home, and this is right on Snelling and Larpenteur, right by the State Fair, just north of the State Fair. So this is the TIES building, like a consortium of school districts that did technology services. It was TIES for 15 years or so, maybe 20 years, and before that it was Harvest States, the original headquarters of Harvest States. It's a beautiful Art Deco building, and my understanding is they're going to keep the exterior, this beautiful Art Deco exterior, and then it'll be multi-housing. Something like 125 units of affordable housing.
Thank you, Councilmember. Mr. Martin, anything to add?
Yes, I'd add that the cost is associated with asbestos and lead-based paint abatement. And that can often be very expensive in a large building like that one. And it also, we have one of the few sources that is available to pay grants for that sort of work. So those requests often are higher because we don't have funding partners that can help us divide that cost.
Thank you. Councilmember Johnson, anything? Okay, thanks. Councilmember Chambliss, were you raising your hand?
No, I didn't. I was looking up with my hand. I mean, I was moving my hand up.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions on that report?
Excuse me, Chair Lilligren. Councilmember Lindstrom has his hand up.
Yeah.
I was just going to make a motion to approve if there's no other questions or comments.
Great, thank you. Is there a second?
Musa, second.
Thank you, Councilmember. And just a moment of discussion on that motion. Those of us who represent Minneapolis and maybe other committee members have been contacted by the city with some of their interests and I don't know, concerns is the right word, but just about the awards, but more of the scoring criteria. And later on this agenda, we'll hear more about the process for reevaluating and establishing the criteria. But I just wanted to acknowledge that we hear the city of Minneapolis. I talked to their intergovernmental relations staff today, and there was no huge objection. They just want to make sure that the city's voices are being heard as we look at the scoring criteria, which they are and they will be. So, any other discussion on the motion? Discussion. Seeing none, Michelle, please call the roll on the motion.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Musse.
Aye.
Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. That motion is adopted, and we will move on to 2020-345. It's the same week item. It's the Metro HRA Moving to Work Program Application Submittal. It's a board resolution 2020-32. And Ms. Smith is here to present. Welcome, Ms. Smith.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Good evening. My name is Terry Smith. I'm the director of the Council's Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and I'm here to present an item on the Moving to Work program, specifically asking for your approval to submit an application and approve 2 resolutions that were attached in the business item. Next slide, please. The Moving to Work program, as you may recall, is a federal designation that allows public housing authorities with the flexibility to design and test innovative strategies, really changing the way federal rent assistance programs are operated. The program allows housing authorities with the ability to waive certain federal regulations and program rules. The program also provides flexibility in how federal funds are spent. There are 3,300 housing authorities administering the voucher program across the country today, and only 39 of these have moving to work designations at this time. Minneapolis Public Housing Authority is one of those agencies right here in our state. The map here shows you, gives you an idea of the distribution across the country. Next slide, please. So there are some statutory requirements of the Moving to Work program and of all moving to work agencies that all must meet these objectives. They must achieve greater cost effectiveness, so show that they can save money in administering programs, federal rent assistance programs in different ways. Requirement to increase housing choice for low-income families, so broaden the choice of housing units. Help residents make progress towards achieving self-sufficiency. Ensuring at least 75% of the families that are served are very low income. Program requires that we must assist substantially the same number of families as prior to receiving the MTW designation, and then assuring that assisted units continue to meet health and safety standards. Having the flexibilities and the opportunities of the MTW program would really be beneficial to the council and to the families it serves. It could really shift the focus from administrative burden to family success. For example, just to give you an idea, if we were able to recertify families on a fixed income every 3 years instead of every year, that would provide tremendous time and money savings to focus on other initiatives. Next slide, please. So there are 2 ways the council is working on obtaining an MTW designation. There's language contained in the 2016 Appropriations Act that authorizes the HUD Secretary to expand MTW designations to adjacent agencies. The council approved, and the Metro HRA made a formal request to HUD way back in August of 2018 to approve a regional moving to work designation for the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority and the Metro HRA. HUD approved the 2 agencies to move forward in concept, and what that means is they're ready to continue dialogue to help work out the arrangements to achieve the regional MTW agency. The second way the council could obtain an MTW designation is for the council to request its own designation and receive that designation. Congress authorized HUD to expand the MTW program to an additional 100 agencies, and these expansions are offered in 4 separate cohorts. The Metro HRA submitted a letter of interest to HUD under the rent reform cohort and has now been invited to submit a full application, which is due January 8th of 2021. Next slide, please. Under the rent reform cohort, there's a requirement that we test a rent simplification technique and do some robust research components along with that. The alternative rent policies will be limited to non-elderly, non-disabled households, so essentially for working families that we serve. One option is for Metro HRA to test a tiered rent system. This is a simplified way to calculate tenant rent portions in $2,500 income tiers rather than the traditional rent calculation method, which is complicated and administratively burdensome, both for the tenants that we serve and for the Metro HRA staff. I will explain more about what this tiered rent formula looks like in a couple of slides. Another option would be to test a stepped rent system that completely disconnects the rent calculation formula from income. Under the stepped rent, a tenant's rent would be placed in a step correlating with 30% of their income in year 1. Every year thereafter, the tenant's rent would increase either by 2% or 4% every year, regardless of what happens to income. The goal of this stepped rent formula is that eventually tenant rent equals the full market rent and the tenants sort of graduate from the program. After some robust analysis of the people that we're currently serving, it was determined that the stepped rent system would have severe negative impact on the voucher holders that we serve. So the Metro HRA is not pursuing that rent alternative at this time. Our focus is becoming focused on the tiered rent option. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is a complicated chart, but it gives you an idea of how a simplified tiered rent structure would work. As you can see, the chart includes $2,500 income tiers. During year 1, a tenant would be placed in the tier associated with their income, where they would pay 30% of their income towards rent. Their rent would remain the same for 3 years then, regardless of what happens with their income. This would allow time for self-sufficiency activities, tenant empowerment activities, and wealth building. After the 3-year period, a tenant's income would be recertified again, and the tenant would again be placed in the tier associated with their income, sort of rebalancing so that they're paying again 30% of their income towards rent. Hardship policies will be developed for tenants whose income decreases during the 3-year period. The tenant rent for the tier is based on the midpoint of the tier. So if you look at, for example, the average income of the families that we're currently serving is $18,000 a year. So if you look at tier 8, this is for families whose incomes fall between $17,500 and $19,999. Tenant rent under this scenario would result in a payment of $469 a month. And we have 202 families that are currently would fall within that tier today. If a family's income is at the lower end of the tier, so at the 17.5, they're going to be paying a little bit more than 30% of their income towards rent. If their income falls at the higher end of the tier, so at closer to the 20,000 mark, then they'll be paying a little bit less than 30% of their income towards rent. But I think the big message is that, again, we would be adopting hardship policies for tenants whose incomes decrease and are having trouble paying their rent. Next slide, please, Greg. Thank you. There are benefits to the tiered rent system. So right now, the families are recertified every single year. It's a burdensome process, not only for the housing authority, but for the families that we serve. So there would be no recertifications or no rent increases for a 3-year period. So if income increases during that 3-year period, the rent would not increase. And the idea is that the tenants then spend the 3-year period on what we're calling tenant empowerment activities. So we would work with them and do goal setting, help them setting up plans to tackle debt, work on getting ahead, and prepare for potential increased income at the 3-year period, and then potentially increased rent if their income has increased during that 3-year period. And then again, hardship policies would be developed for tenants whose incomes decrease. Next slide, please. There's a lot of words on this slide and a lot of numbers, but it's really meant to show the impact to tenants and what that might look like under a tiered rent system. So some tenants will experience an increase in rent during their the first year of implementation. And this is mainly because the tiered rent model removes all the deductions that are currently in place under the traditional rent calculation formula. And so the idea is, again, having a standardized, more simplified tiered rent system that's easier to understand. Again, the goal of testing the tiered rent structure is to shift the focus from administrative burden to family success. Based on who we are serving today, the chart at the right shows current households and the impact if this were implemented today. And again, you'll notice the numbers don't match up because these are only households that are non-elderly, non-disabled, so essentially working families. The highest number of households would fall into the $25 to $49 rent increase category. Households that have larger increases in year one are likely those that had large high deductions under the traditional rent calculation, such as high childcare deductions. Part of the services that we would provide to families would be to help them navigate through this. Maybe they would be eligible for a hardship. Maybe they would be, for example, eligible for the childcare assistance program. And so part of what the service we would provide is to work through this with families. It is important to point out the cost savings to the housing authority. As we've had our budget conversations with you all in recent years, you all know that the federal funds that we get from the federal government no longer allow us to serve all possible families. If we were to move to a tiered rent system based on what family incomes are today, we would experience a cost savings about $1.1 million in subsidy costs. And part of the process would be, if we were approved by HUD to move forward under this MTW program, we would have a formal process in place to develop a formalized moving to work plan that would involve engagement with you all, as well as communities and voucher holders. And then we would decide and make a plan for what we want to do with that money. It would be enough to serve an additional 115 families. We could provide additional deeper services for families to help them with goal setting, recovering and overcoming debt, setting them up for success. We could serve more families. It could be a balanced approach. Really, the sky is the limit. But it's important to point that out. I indicated in a previous slide there would be some robust research components. The idea is to test alternative rent simplification methods to see if tenants are successful. And so what would happen is if we were approved for this, families would be randomly chosen to either participate in the simplified rent formula or stay on the traditional rent calculation formula. So half would be on the tiered rent, half would be on the traditional rent calculation formula. And again, there would be a hardship process in place for families who are unable to pay their rent under the new scenario. Next slide, please. This chart is meant to show the comparisons. So as I indicated earlier, we're continuing to travel along both paths in gaining MTW status. Again, I think it would be a tremendous accomplishment for the HRA and for the families it serves to obtain an MTW designation in one of these ways. If we were to obtain a regional MTW designation, it's like a tongue twister, through MPHA, the MTW flexibilities would only apply to a small number of voucher holders. So those that are working through portability, so moving across jurisdictional lines, that are part of a joint mobility program, or that are part of a pooled project-based voucher program. Those are the three buckets that we submitted to HUD when we initially submitted our moving to work request to HUD back in 2018. The designation would come through Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. So the idea is they would be the lead agency for the MTW regional program. And so the flexibilities would flow through them to this small percentage of voucher holders. The program would really align nicely to the MPHA and Metro HRA collaboration efforts that are already in place. We've been working to ease administrative burden for families and landlords working across jurisdictional lines for a few years with them. And so it would align nicely with that. It would be kind of cool to be the first agency in the country to receive this regional designation. And as I indicated earlier, it's been in the appropriations language since 2016. So HUD is anxious to get moving and continuing the conversations on this. But you know, on a downside, it's complicated to work through all the details in the agreements. And we've been working closely with the general counsel office as well as MPHA's attorneys. And it's complicated to put the agreements together to figure out how the partnership works. Again, with the goal to serve families better and smarter. On the right side of the chart, these are the benefits and sort of challenges of obtaining the MTW designation through the rent reform initiative. This would mean that MTW flexibilities apply to our entire program, which in my opinion is a good thing. Some of the flexibilities would apply to all 7,000 voucher holders, even though only a small percentage of them would be on the rent reform. There are other flexibilities, MTW flexibilities that come with this that could benefit all of our voucher holders. And a simple example that I gave earlier is recertifying families every 3 years instead of every year, which is extremely burdensome. The Metro HRA then would have its own MTW designation, so we wouldn't be flowing through Minneapolis to get that designation. This approach would also align nicely with the collaborations that are already starting to form in partnership with Metro HRA and MPHA. I think a downside is it will be extremely competitive. The expansion cohorts that are awarded to additional 100 agencies, there are only 3 out of the 100 that will be awarded to large agencies, which includes Metro HRA. So it will be very competitive. I know of at least 10 housing authorities across the country that are applying under this rent reform cohort. And then there's a robust research component to test the success of rent reform. And it will take some time, but I think it's a good thing because it really tests innovative ways of redesigning how rent assistance programs are operated. Next slide, please. We did some voucher holder engagement. We had 2 public meetings in October 2020. Although it would have been nice to do those in person, we conducted them on a virtual setting. We used WebEx. We had nearly 200 voucher holders attend, about 100 voucher holders at each session, which is really exciting, and we were thrilled with the turnout of that. There was general overall support for the MTW program from the families who attended that, and comments and questions really focused around how will the cost savings be spent? And, you know, my response to that was, that is to be determined. There are all kinds of options for us, but we could serve additional families. We could focus more time and staff effort on working with families, setting them up for success. And those decisions will be made in conjunction with residents and with you all as policymakers. There were we had one-on-one conversations with probably 20 families after the fact, our outreach team members, to determine how the rent reform initiative would specifically impact their family. There were a lot of concern of, what if my income goes down and I can't pay the rent? And the response to that is, we will have hardship options in place for families whose incomes go down and they're unable to pay the rent. And then a lot of reminders that the program only, or the rent reform initiative would only apply to working families, essentially. Excluded are families that are headed by a person with disabilities and headed by an elderly person who typically do not have employment income and are on a fixed income. Next slide, please. So if we gain your support this evening and gain the support of the full council on Wednesday, the plan would be to submit a full application for the expansion cohort under rent reform. The application is pretty much ready to go. It's due on January 8th. We would continue dialogue with the MPHA and HUD toward obtaining a regional MTW designation. If either is approved by HUD, there will be lots of opportunity for you to weigh in more, and we would, would require formal council approval before we would become an MTW agency. And that would include developing a very detailed moving to work plan. So which flexibilities under the MTW program would we adopt? And that would include, of course, engagement with you all, with the public, with voucher holders and communities. It would include collaborating with educational and research institutions for the robust research components of this. And if we end up going down the road of collaborating and getting the MTW authority through MPHA, there will be agreements to enter into, and we will work closely with our legal teams to develop those. Next slide, please. So the proposed action before you all tonight is that the Metropolitan Council adopt 2 resolutions, number 2020-32 and 2020-33. One is to your approval to submit the full application under the rent reform expansion cohort, and one is to continue conversations and dialogue with HUD and MPHA to obtain a regional MTW designation. So adopt the resolutions as required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, authorizing the Director, Metropolitan Council Housing and Redevelopment Authority to submit the full application for the MTW program expansion, and to continue conversations with HUD toward forming a regional moving to work program. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Smith, for your assistance and your energy approach to this. Just getting us to the point of communication. Tremendous amount of work.
Excuse me, Chair Lilligren. There's something wrong with your mic. I think you might have to tilt it down.
It was.
There we go.
Had it
Thank
up.
you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Yeah. So I just wanted to thank Ms. Smith and her team for their incredible work, and it's just getting us to this point. I can tell has just been a gargantuan effort, and just to thank you and your team for keeping us in the forefront of innovation in housing here in the country. And so, questions on this report, Councilmember Chambliss, then Councilmember Lynch.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a lot of work, and we're pushing this up the hill. Just something that I thought about. I know it has nothing to do with us, but the naming of the program, Moving to Work. I know that's politically based, but it just, it has a lot of connotations about public welfare. But I guess sometimes that's what it takes to get things passed through. It seems to me that the biggest impact from what I heard are families that are larger would no longer get the deductions. So it almost seems like, a penalty for having a larger family, for lack of a better way to put it. I know that the plan is to have, a robust program to help them out if they, have income issues or job issues. So we definitely would need to prepare for that if we were lucky enough to get approved for this. I like the fact that it would increase the authority of the Metro HRA from a regional standpoint, so that is good as well. But I'm just really concerned about what's going to happen to those larger families. And I think we need to have some robust problem solving for individuals if we're going to go with this more simplified approach, because every family is different. It's more than just about what the rent is. And if you're looking at the income levels, if you make 20,000, it's 400 and something. I know people who make 40,000 and they're struggling to make that same rent, with their other expenses. So it's good to be a part of kind of an experiment that helps us to look at these issues more deeply. So even though there are some challenges that I have mentioned, I would be in support of highlighting the issues with rent and looking at reform and being a part of that initiative.
Thank you, Councilmember. Ms. Smith, did you want to comment?
I think my comment is I agree with everything you said, and those are exactly the challenges we've been playing with. And when we look at the program overall, I think we could provide tremendous service to the families that we serve. If there was a different funding formula that allows us to be more flexible, I think we could provide some more one-on-one supports for families to help them work through some of the challenges, things that we can't do today. So agree with you with everything you said.
Thank you. Further discussion on this report? Councilmember Johnson. Oh, I'm sorry. Councilmember Lindstrom, then Councilmember Johnson. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Real quick, Mr. Chair, and by the way, yeah, the name sticks out to me like a sore thumb. I mean, and it's totally political. You're absolutely correct. As if they're not already working one or two jobs already. I suspect that's because the program isn't targeted for those who are elderly or disabled, but who knows? And you may have mentioned this, Terry, but the total number of people that this will impact of our 7,000, you said pretty small, or a small percentage. Remind me or remind us what the numbers we're talking about here.
Sure. So if we were to get a moving to work designation on our own through rent reform, we would take the number of non-elderly, non-disabled families that we serve, which is about 30, I think it's 3,400. It's around 3,000, and half of those would be on the randomly selected to either be put on the tiered rent and the other half would remain on a traditional rent calculation. And so it's about half. But some of the flexibilities that we can get with the moving to work designation, like recertifications every 3 years, and particularly for people on fixed income, that can apply to our entire program of 7,000, and it can create tremendous time and administrative savings, and reduce the burden for the families that we serve. So the tiered rent would only apply to probably 1,500 to 2,000, depending on how you slice it and dice it. But the MTW flexibilities would apply to the whole program, other pieces of that. And then under the Minneapolis side, if we were to get MTW designation, it would only apply to a smaller portion of our program. Those that are working through portability, which at any given time is about 200 families. But as that grows, that pool would grow. We would pool some project-based vouchers, so it would apply to them. And then it would apply to families that are enrolled in a joint mobility program. And so it's a much smaller piece under that.
Councilmember Lindstrom?
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And just to speak from my experience, I was interim CEO at Little Earth of United Tribes, a project-based Section 8 housing development, and the burden of recertification on both the organization and on the tenant is enormous. And so this idea of deferring that to once every 3 years is a significant benefit. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Terry, for this work that you're doing. I'm so grateful. Couple of things. When there would be adjustments downward in family income, I just hope that the system can be timely in that, so that there's not a lot of lag where they get really far behind, or the problem exacerbates itself. And I know we're government and we do our very best, but we're going to be working through a new program if this moves forward. And I know your sensitivity, you guys are all over this, but just something that, and I want to say too, I agree with everything else that was said before. The things that Councilmember Chambliss raised, I was thinking about those as well. So thanks for that. Also, I'm curious, when you talked about being able to offer some other supports for people, with saving for the future and maybe being financially prepared, does this also then maybe include helping them if they want to be on a pathway to home ownership? Because I know we've talked about that too, is finding a way to help bridge people from, being renters into home ownership should they choose that path. And would it have a way for us to positively impact that for families?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Johnson, I think it's part of the discussion, something we've talked about at length. Our work plan in 2020, including the exploration of a home ownership program. And I would say the pandemic prevented us from getting there, but it's on our work plan for 2021. But I think it's absolutely a consideration. And, one of the questions came up with the resident engagement. One of the questions was, could we do tuition reimbursement? Could we help with home ownership down payment assistance? It's all of those things. We can essentially, the federal money becomes very flexible, and then it's up to, I guess, you all and the residents and you all as policymakers to determine how we want to spend that savings and money. But one of the things we do now with our mobility program is we work with families, and if they have a goal of home ownership, we do everything we can to help them do goal setting to get there. And I think mobility supports we currently provide for the families that are on that program, the number of people receiving those is small because we just don't have the staff time to do it. And if we could decrease the staff time spent on some of these administrative things, it would increase our capacity to work with families towards things like home ownership.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I think that's really excellent because we've talked about it and have been working towards that if that's the direction we would go. And I would say too, there are a lot of other partners, and this, Terry, out there that are also working, to help support that. And maybe we could, like we do, have collaborations and partnerships, that could be maybe broaden the impact if and when this is implemented. And then again, the savings was over $1 million. Is that right when I saw the slide? that comes from savings to the program, but it also said that we could support an additional 115 families. So that interests me as well. And I'm sure that the savings don't go directly to the 115 families, certainly, but there's, administrative savings that can be redeployed into other things, and we can take on additional families. Would that be a fair statement based on what you said?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Johnson, yes. So, and that 1.1 million is based on who we're serving today, their incomes. We're guessing, which families are going to be randomly selected to participate in the tiered rent. So there are a lot of things, but the 1.1 million, if we were to use all of that to provide additional subsidy to families, we could support an additional 115 families. There's lots of feedback. I don't think that's on my end. Can you hear that?
Yes. I think it's Council Member Muse. I think he probably is in queue to speak.
Oh, okay.
We can't see, but so I think it's feedback from him. So,
Chair?
Thank
okay. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know if Councilmember Johnson is quite finished. Are you, Councilmember Johnson?
Essentially, the only other thing I would say is, because we are first and kind of leading in this, and yet there are other communities around the country. And Terry, you had mentioned, how the program is set the way it is, and even we'd want some changes maybe, but it is what it is. But I think it's important that we work with our congressional delegation as well to really clue them into the innovative work that's happening. And I know we'd have many of them probably lean into this, and then we can, how they do work at nonpartisan or bipartisan coalitions if we need to loop in some others from around the country. But I think this is not only newsworthy, but I think, we might get some, it won't happen overnight. Nothing does in DC, but I think it's worth them knowing what's going on.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Johnson, we've been working with our federal lobbyist the last couple of weeks. And so, in fact, we just drafted letters this week to send through the congressional delegation up to the powers that be at HUD. So we're working on that, and I think it is newsworthy, and I think we have a benefit because we are doing some creative things along these lines already, which will bode well for us. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Muse, thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Terry, I just want a quick follow-up on Johnson's question. I think previously you and Lisa were exploring the homeownership model of self-Mankato. And not only you're exploring your encouragement, but also setting up the program. So I just want to know if you have any update on that, and if that's a part of the 2021, because really homeownership, especially for large families, it's timely and there's a real crisis here. So I just want to know if you have any updates on that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Muse. It was on our work plan for this year, and we didn't get to it. I think all of our time shifted to pandemic planning. And, an example, we have 21 staff who have a caseload of clients anywhere from, they're all around 450. And they spent a lot of their time processing income changes for people who experienced decreased or lost income during COVID-19. And we had to shift around a lot of our processes. So we didn't get to the home ownership research that we intended to. It remains on our work plan for 2021. In fact, Lisa and I were just talking about it the other day as part of our update. And we probably won't get to it till mid-year, but we do hope to get there this year and explore adopting a home ownership program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on the report? Questions? Seeing none, Ms. Smith has proposed a series of actions that will allow our staff to submit the application for the moving to work program. And I would entertain a motion to approve, please.
Vento moves approval.
Johnson seconds.
Thank you, Council Members Vento and Johnson. The discussion on the motion? Discussion. Hearing none, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen?
Aye.
Chambliss?
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Lilligren,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Musse,
Aye.
Pinto,
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. That item is adopted. And before we move on to our next business item, which will be the last business item, I'll note that business item 10 has been postponed to January 4th, 2021. And the information items, we have two. And one, Director Barajas has informed me that the second one, the 2021 Work Planning for Housing Strategies, can be postponed. It's not urgent, but I would like us to hang in there and get through the 2021 Livable Communities Act program criteria discussion. So with that, let's move on to our final business item today, 2020-346. It's a same week item, the revised 2021 payment standards for Metro HRA rent assistance programs. Ms. Smith.
Terry, you're on mute.
Ms. Smith?
I wonder if we lost her connection.
Oh, Ms. Smith, are you there? Is this an item, Director Barajas, that you can step in and at least start until we figure out what happened with it?
I can fill in for Terry here until she comes
It
on.
looks like she may be back.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are,
Oh,
Terry.
I don't know what's happening. Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and I'm just going to keep my video off because I don't know what's happening here, but I'm having some trouble. Sorry about that. Do you want me to go ahead, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please, Ms. Smith.
Okay. So this item is asking that the Metropolitan Council adopt revised payment standards as shown in Table 1 for the Housing Choice Voucher and other rent assistance programs effective January 1st. You may recall you passed this item and it went to the full council on December 9th, revised payment standards, and I linked to the previous business item in my business item, so maybe you had a chance to look at that. Essentially, what has happened here is that although the Council's Housing and Redevelopment Authority service area does not include Minneapolis or St. Paul, the Metro HRA operates two very small rent assistance programs in these cities. And there were two zip codes in my previous chart and my previous business item where the payment standard increases were not included. So my action tonight is asking that you adopt the new table as in Table 1 attached to the business item that include the zip codes 55115 that cover St. Paul, Grant, and Matamidi, none of which are in our standard service area, but for these two very small programs. And then a second zip code in Minneapolis, 55415. So the action before you specifically is that the Metropolitan Council adopt revised payment standards as shown in Table 1 for the Housing Choice Voucher and other rent assistance programs effective January 1st. And with that, I'll answer questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Any questions on that report? Essentially a correction to an earlier action that we took. Any questions? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion that the Metropolitan Council adopt the revised payment standards. Is there a motion?
So moved by Atlas Ingebretson.
Thank you. A second?
Second by Lee.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any discussion on that motion? Discussion. Seeing none, Michelle, please call the roll on the motion.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebretson.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom.
Aye.
Musse.
Aye.
Vento,
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That motion is adopted. And we'll move on to our information items. The 2021 Livable Communities Act program criteria discussion may be kind of long, so I'm just going to go ahead, unless there's objection, and ask Director Barajas to postpone the second item, the 2021 work planning for housing strategies, and defer that into the new year. And if there's no objection, we will go forward with the 2021 Livable Communities Act program criteria discussion. Ms. Beard.
Good evening.
And Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to add Councilmember Chambliss, who's graciously agreed to present with me. I will try to keep it at a clip here and focus on what's necessary. As you recall from November, we talked about some higher level scoring changes that we are proposing for 2021 that really were focused on kind of reconnecting functionally the scoring criteria to the foundational purpose of the Livable Communities Act and the Thrive policies that don't already sort of overlap and kind of mirror what we see in the LCA. Today we're going to dive into a couple of more specific criteria pieces. There's a lot to digest in your board packet, and it includes a lot of changes showing the scoring reorganized and reflecting the changes that we talked about in November. But Councilmember Chambliss and I discussed, along with the help of the other members of the housing work group and my team and colleagues, kind of what to pull out, what needed to be really, what we needed to make sure there was an opportunity for folks to hear about and have give input on. So with that, next slide, please, Greg. So we're gonna, you can just go on to the next slide, Greg. Thank you. Here is a little calendar, and basically what I want to just kind of remind folks is that I will be back one more time in January. Again, at that point, I think we'll need to start moving into funding considerations for the programs, but we can also discuss any kind of additional scoring items that come up today that need some more input or some more feedback for you all, and then be in front of you on February 1st to ask for a recommendation to approve 2021 funding and scoring criteria. Next slide, please. So this is that kind of just helpful upside down pyramid to kind of remind ourselves where the scoring criteria comes from. I just want to use this slide to mention that the bulk of this conversation, really all of it, today's conversation, the scoring criteria changes we're talking about are specific to the Livable Communities Demonstration Account and the Livable Communities Demonstration Account that's specifically for transit-oriented development. And that's really because the Local Housing Incentives Account and tax-based revitalization programs that are also funds in the account, they're their own kind of defined, very specific programs. The statutory language gives a lot more specific direction for those, and their purpose is more kind of specific. So, some things that you may think, well, I thought I heard Marcus say this about TBRA may not apply, but certainly ask. But I just like to remind folks that the TBRA and LHA are more specific programs with less kind of flexibility to define things and set different scoring criteria. Next slide, please. So you all know this has been my rookie year managing the Livable Communities Act programs, and to my poor staff's detriment, I decided to pick everything apart and then figure out how to put it back together. It's been a year of evaluation, and it's been really remarkable, and I'm so grateful for all the amazing help from my colleagues and the members of the housing work group. So just a quick slide to remind you all of the months and months of meetings and analysis and outreach and engagement we've been doing, and so we don't bring these changes to you lightly. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Chambliss now to introduce you more completely to the housing work group and the role that they've been playing in helping guide staff as we've evaluated the LCA programs.
Thank you, Tara, for that good introduction. I have enjoyed working with the housing work group, which is newly appointed by the chair of the Metropolitan Council and includes Molly Cummings, Robert Lilligren, and Judy Johnson, and myself. It's been a lot of information, so if Tara was new, then I'm much newer. But I've enjoyed participating and getting feedback and collaborating with the other council members. We started out with this work group in June of 2020, and our group's initial focus was on the Lca evaluation, and that's what we're going to continue to work on, as she mentioned in the timeline. Our housing work group goals are to implement the strategies as identified in our housing goals. Of course, evaluating our LCA programs and looking at the guidance that as a council we can give towards that, and also addressing homelessness, which, as we all know, has been a growing problem in our region. So moving on, I will turn it back over to Ms. Beard to talk about the evaluation and answer any questions that we might have.
Thank you, Council Member. Greg, could you advance the slide? Thank you. So the specific LCA evaluation questions or kind of changes that kind of want to make sure folks understand today and have a chance to provide feedback or questions. If you recall from the November conversation, a big piece of that was talking about the role that innovation and demonstration criteria were playing in the criteria, and the staff recommendation to eliminate innovation and demonstration value from the criteria as it was being utilized, not because innovative projects aren't great or projects trying new things to show that they can be done are not great, but again, the purpose being to refocus on the scoring criteria and the funding awards to the foundational purpose of Livable Communities Act, which really is these sort of three foundational pieces. It's creating a full range of housing choices, access to permanent living wage jobs, and compact, efficient development, and then the sort of interconnectedness and movement between all three. So for our specific level conversations today, we're going to talk about changes based on these questions. So how do we redistribute points that we previously evaluated for innovation and demonstration value? And if you recall, in November, I mentioned that took up about 35% of the total score available. We're looking at projects for innovation and demonstration value. So there's a lot of space, I guess, to think about. The next question we asked was, what's the most effective way to evaluate equity? And I'll be the first to admit that, again, starting about a year ago today with the 2020 fund distribution plan and scoring criteria in front of me, I knew that I wanted to spend a lot of time in 2020 thinking about how the scoring criteria evaluates for equity, and in a way that makes sense and allows for communities in very different contexts to still have access to the program, and kind of, right-sizing the criteria for the capacity of the developers and the cities that are applying for the funds. And then finally, we had a lot of good conversations about the concept of readiness, and we did some research and conversations on that to talk about the most effective way to evaluate readiness. So again, these are not the only changes. These are sort of the big three, I think, that come out of some of these more specific scoring criteria recommendations. Next slide, please, Greg. So jumping right into the changes in scoring distribution, here's that table showing that the gray, the demonstration, innovation, and catalytic value criteria was about 35% of the score for 2020. And when you look at the statutory purpose of LCA, those are those three kind of pillars, housing, jobs, and compact, efficient development. That was about 39% of the total score. And the Thrive outcomes, things like equity and sustainability, that are certainly important and should be connected to our funding. And in fact, the Act does state that our regional development framework should influence scoring criteria. That was constituting about 26% of the points. And it's mostly science with a dash of art, because there are certainly some criteria that sort of overlap. If we look through that same lens at what we're proposing for 2021, it's looking more like sort of this somewhat 50-50 with a slight edge on the statutory purpose of LCA. And so when you look at the scoring tables in the packet, you kind of see that that's how it's organized, that the first section in terms of impact and what the proposed project's impact will be looks at those three features of housing, jobs, and compact connected development as the kind of basis for much of the statutory purpose of the program. And then other Thrive factors such as, again, equity, sustainability, stewardship are all kind of factored into those points on the 49% part of the chart there. And I'll just add, for the blue, in terms of the statutory purpose, there's still a lot within each of these colors. Both in the past and in the current proposed scoring criteria, they're pretty evenly distributed in terms of how many of those points go for housing, how many of those points are for jobs, how many of those points are for compact connected development. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Councilmember Chambliss. Councilmember, you're mute.
Okay, thank you. I really like that graph that was on page 8 because it really gives us a strong visual of where we are today and how we want to improve to meet those 3 pillars that Tara had talked about. It allows us to refocus the program based on its intended statutory purpose and helps us to meet those Thrive goals, which are really important in terms of livability, equity, sustainability, and stewardship. So as a result, we looked at, she talked about how the innovation and demonstration value criteria was 30 plus of the points and wasn't as closely aligned as some of the other criteria. So that's what we're kind of right sizing. And also making the criteria more specific, more clear, so that it's more measurable, it's clear for our applicants, and it's clear for our scoring. So at this point, I'd like to ask if there are any personal thoughts about where we're at today in terms of reevaluating the scoring criteria. Tara? If there are no questions,
Yeah.
Tara? Oh, someone had a question.
Thanks, Councilmember Chambliss. I was just going to make a comment, and then if I'm certainly happy to have you facilitate this discussion part. It's probably easier that way. But just to say, this was a lot of discussion, a lot of sort of suggesting this and seeing what the impact would be further. I would say the kind of guiding philosophy of the housing work group was trying to more closely align this with the statutory language, and that not everybody in the housing community is, what am I trying to say? A lot of people feel that this is a sort of for innovation and catalyst investment, and that in the sort of subcategories of scoring, or when we get more specific to allotting points, there are ways of incentivizing innovation and catalyst criteria, but I think the proposed almost balance between our outcomes, our Thrive 2040 outcomes, and then the statutory purpose of the LCA, I think is really reflected in what we're proposing for 2021. Thanks.
Sure. Tara, did you want to speak to how the innovation and demonstration value applies to going above and beyond? And it still allows us applicants to be competitive?
Absolutely. I think that, to be honest, we had a fairly kind of robust conversation around this in November, talking about kind of the why innovation and demonstration value they were more subjective to score. It was much more difficult to explain kind of why projects, and it got a little bit too easy, I think, to start to evaluate projects based on maybe an aesthetic preference or a design preference versus, is this doing what the act is asking for, creating connected, compact, efficient development via jobs and housing. But to your point exactly, Councilmember Chambliss, innovative amazing, cool projects doing cool things are very much still going to be competitive, especially to the degree that that innovation leads to those foundational purposes of the program. And I'm happy to take any more questions, or we can move on. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Councilmember Wolf. Can you hear me?
Please, Councilmember Wolf. Yep, please.
Thank
Wolf.
you. I get what we're working towards. I'm not really comfortable with the 51-49 split between statutory purpose and thrive. It seems to me like the statutory purpose should be more than just barely over half, if that makes any sense. I mean,
Mr. Chair?
Please.
May I? Thank you,
Yes,
Councilmember.
please,
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Wolf. That's that totally makes sense. I would offer that the statute itself does say that the policies of the Metropolitan Development Guide adopted by the council should be a part of the scoring criteria, right up actually at the front of the statute before it starts to list that other criteria. So I do think that there is some consideration, to give to that. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair?
Councilmember Wolf.
I understand. It's just weighting them basically evenly just doesn't really make sense to me. I'm thinking more like 2/3, 1/3 or something rather than, and even before we had more towards the statutory than we did towards thrive. But I just wonder how that's going to be perceived as are we fundamentally changing how we're doing things away from what is the statutory requirements towards whatever the council feels like doing in a 10-year whatever.
Thank you, Councilmember. Did you want a response on that, Councilmember Wolf, or that was just stating your position?
Stating how I feel so far, because they asked.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. And then it looks like Councilmember Johnson asked if we go back to the slide, to the side-by-side distribution graphs. So that's slide 8. And Councilmember Johnson, did you want to?
Yeah, and I appreciate the comment about the split 51-49, and Tara and the rest of the housing policy work group, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are increasing, the statutory purpose scoring criteria from 39% to 51%, which was one of the goals, to making sure we were aligned with what the statutes were saying. And the 49%, I don't think necessarily precludes anything that the statutes are also saying, but it starts to pick up those very goals, that we're trying to forward throughout the region. So I don't have a problem with this distribution at all, because for me, it's definitely an improvement over what we were, have been doing in the past. And I also just want to point out too, that when Charlie Vanderarty from Metro City spoke earlier about, city's strong support of Livable Communities Act, they did, talk about it being tied to the purpose of the statute, and also trying to be inclusive throughout the region of cities that can come in and apply for the grants. And I think that was another aspect of what we were trying to accomplish in some of our work too. And to the point around demonstration, innovation, and catalyst criteria, he also mentioned that being, that's subjective. And I think what I learned on the work group was that, we would score points, we would give out points for those things, but it wasn't necessarily that we could track it and follow it and, see that it, spurred any future innovation for other projects. I don't think we were able to really track that at all. And I would say, if I heard Mr. Vanderarty correctly, on behalf of cities, that's very subjective too, because a smaller community might not be able to do the wow and the pow that maybe a larger community or developers that have, more I think, resources behind some of their programs. So I think to Councilmember Wolf's point, it's well taken, but I think we're definitely moving in the right direction with where we're dividing out those scoring categories in the 21. But certainly it's all open for some input, and it's just, I think, some of those discussions that we kind of wrestled with too in the work group on how we're moving from one over to the other.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on the presentation so far? And I can't see everyone, so please
This
speak up.
is Councilmember Chambliss. I just wanted to say that a part of the review over the several meetings looked at the statute and all of the existing criteria, and looked at how the demonstration, innovation, and catalyst criteria fit into the statute. And I think I heard Councilmember Wolf say that we don't want to go away from the statute, but this is a point in time, and it's possible, likely, that at some point the demonstration, innovation, and catalyst criteria got added, and it's not as evident in the existing statute. And the revision of the scoring criteria also fits and is aligned with our Thrive goals. So this gets us closer to an improvement in meeting the statute as well as our Thrive goals. And again, the innovation is a little bit more subjective and harder to measure. And as Councilmember Johnson said, there are some cities who would find it more difficult to compete in terms of really highly innovative criteria, all the bells and whistles that are not necessarily getting us closer to our purpose and intention for Thrive.
Mr. Chair, this is Councilmember Wolf again. I just be clear, I was not suggesting that we should get back the demonstration, innovation, and catalyst. If that didn't come through in what I said before, I'm not asking for those points to come back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember. Any further discussion on the presentation to this point?
Chair.
Yeah, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. I want to just say that I agree with Councilmember Johnson's point, and I think for me the biggest piece is if we find a question, if we find that projects that really align with our needs in the region aren't scoring how we would anticipate they would, what is the opportunity for shifting or adjusting, or is there an appeal process or something like that, given that we're making a shift?
So I would look to Ms. Beard maybe to answer that question, but I would just note we approve these annually, right? And so we do have an opportunity to adjust these as we're going forward based on evaluating how well they're working, input from our participating communities. Ms. Beard, is there something?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilmember. Absolutely. So we update, or update's probably not even really the right word. We adapt the scoring criteria for the approximate year each year at about this time. And so every year is an opportunity to continuously evaluate and make sure that the criteria is doing what we hopefully intentionally designed it to do. But even in that regard, to your point, Councilmember Lilligren, Chair Lilligren, the awards as staff recommends them come forward to you based on that scoring criteria, but it is ultimately the council's adoption of the funding recommendation. So ultimately it is the council's decision who to fund. And so there's that wall as well, or that mile marker.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. I just know in the last year, we did have a situation, there were questions. So I think, I get it, it's a year, but that can really be for smaller projects. They may not be able to survive that year. So I appreciate that feedback and hope we're just continuing to be mindful of what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson.
Yeah.
Just briefly, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, I mean, we talked about that exact thing. You know, this is really about realigning to achieve our goals. And, you know, is it perfect? Well, we don't know yet. We'll see what the results are, but I think it's a really, really strong effort led by Tara and team and this work group and everybody in the cities. And, you know, I mean, if you look at who, you know, has already given feedback on this, I think we're really headed in the right direction. But there's always room in the future for refinement. We ultimately do have the say, but to your point, exactly, I think that's what we're trying to do. And again, credit to Tara a year ago saying, hey, we should look at this. And yes, it's a good thing.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Further discussion on the report so far? Further discussion? Seeing none, Ms. Beard, should I turn it back to you or Councilmember Chambliss? Okay.
Yep. And Greg, if you could go forward 2 slides, please. Thank you so much. So now I'm going to spend some time talking to you about some proposed changes to the equity criteria specifically, as well as kind of how we would score for it, evaluate for it in the proposed 2021 criteria. So to do that, I want to kind of remind you all of the reorganization of the scoring criteria that I talked about in November as well, from a kind of list of multiple kind of, dozen scoring categories to a kind of a focused, organized, helps keep us in this kind of accountability intention of what is the proposed project impact, how is the proposed project process, how is it designed, how is it implemented, and then who is the project team. So with that in mind, next slide, please. So with that in mind, I'm going to walk through in the what, how, and who categories, what equity criteria, maybe not in the exact same version, but at a high level kind of intent, where the equity criteria is being carried over from 2020 and where it would belong in 2021, whether there was any criteria from 2020 around equity that we're proposing not be included in 2021 and any new equity criteria. So you can see here in the proposed project impact or what section, we absolutely are carrying over equity outcomes in terms of housing and jobs, again, with some tweaks to how we're doing it in the specific criteria, but we'll get to that. There isn't any equity related criteria to project outcomes that we are proposing to carry over into 2021. And we're actually suggesting one additional criteria that looks at equity outcomes in terms of transit. Next slide. From a how perspective or the project process carried over from 2020 are equitable engagement activities and equitable development strategies. What we aren't proposing to keep for criteria in 2020 is an analysis of displacement risk and mitigation. And I want to emphasize that the concept of kind of displacement risk and the role a project plays in the potential gentrification or displacement of a community. I think what we kind of realized looking back is that that's a really hard kind of analysis or offering for one project. Like displacement and gentrification in a community is about more than just one project. So we weren't getting the kind of answers to the questions we had thought about displacement impact of a potential project that really helped us understand how to evaluate that. And so, we would get responses to application questions that would maybe say, well, the site's vacant, so no one's being displaced. And we knew that what we had meant was, has this project been thought about in the context of the broader community's growth and change in a way that will not contribute towards displacement of folks that have already been marginalized and left out enough. And so I just want to express my intent to not drop this and forget about it, but to acknowledge that we weren't getting answers that helped us differentiate. And frankly, we didn't know how to ask the right questions or what a project would be able to do to help us decide how that should impact their score. So it's not going away. It's just, from my perspective, it's coming from a first do no harm. If I don't feel like I know how we're scoring this, how we'll evaluate for it, and what it actually means to differentiate between the projects, then I don't think we should keep it. But I absolutely intend to continue to explore how we measure displacement risk, how we measure gentrification risk, and what role that should play in consideration of project funding. Next slide. Thank you. In terms of who or the proposed project team, and that often gets at questions of readiness and capacity, there haven't been any criteria in that category or parts of the scoring criteria in past years, so nothing to drop, but we are proposing a new criterion in this category around equity that looks at representation, and is the project team kind of designed and does it include partners that reflect or are uniquely able to respond to the specific demographics of the community. And I'm happy to take Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen's question now if it's related to this section of we don't have to wait till the end.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Councilmember?
Chair, I'm happy, thank you. I'm happy to wait too. It was related to the last slide. I just, displacement and gentrification are super important issues. Of course, we all know that, and I appreciate and I heard you state that. I'm wondering two things. One, is there the opportunity to continue to collect information so that it's not like just a missed year? And as cities and communities needs around this and understanding around this grow, I anticipate better articulation and understanding. And it just, I would hate for us to have a gap year in collecting information. Now, if that's considered in the score or not, maybe that's not considered in the score, but I just wonder about that piece. And then if not, I would really like to have a clear commitment to what will happen to explore this topic further. Just can't think of a more poignant piece for our communities than displacement and the modification of public space by those who can for their own advantage at the cost of those who can't. And so those are my two wonderments.
Thank you. Ms. Beard, did you have a comment or any of the housing work group?
I will definitely jump in, Mr. Chair, if that's okay. Those words mean a lot to me, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. I really appreciate that. I just want to reassure you that we aren't losing anything, and really any kind of displacement gentrification work we have done at the council, we are the ones that can kind of almost tell the applicants what the impact their project will have, because we're the ones looking at these bigger systems, and they're often just really looking at this site. And that's kind of what I noticed was like not hitting the mark at all and not very helpful. So this ongoing work that I really want to reassure you I am committed to includes connecting with our partners in research with Kristen and Matt and the work they're doing on equity, the role equity plays in development and growth. And when we know what we need to know to evaluate projects in terms of their impact on those outcomes that are not what we're trying to support, we will get that criteria in there. We just need it to be right.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. I guess what I'm asking for is just to be clear, are we going to continue to ask that question, just not use it towards the score? Because you said we weren't going to be losing anything. We're not going to ask communities about that question at all, and it's not contributing to the score.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember, thank you for the clarifying question. My offering was that the question we were asking was, have you thought about whether your project's going to contribute to gentrification or displacement, something to that effect? And the information we were given was information that we already could tell because of the nature of the project. Like we already knew if it was a vacant site that was then turning into housing, or if the site was market rate. So there was no new information we were getting from the project or the application that we didn't already know.
Chair.
Thank you. Yep.
So the other part of that question is, can we just get a really clear understanding of how this discussion will continue on? And if I could offer, sometimes when we're doing things like this, having processes like this, as much as it is about an application, it's also about providing educational triggers and opportunities for people. I just want to support the idea of asking questions that help inform our decision making going forward, but also help to inform the decision making of those who are applying for the funds. And I would also, I really value, and you all know this, our wonderful research department and our role in research. I also would encourage us to take the time to really understand what displacement means in, from a community-based perspective. And when you look at people and neighborhoods' connection to land, whether we're talking about indigenous communities here or the first African American communities that migrated as churches from the South and set up community-based homes as a collective in St. Paul and in North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, the sadness that comes with gentrification is really poignant. I'll give you an example. Just recently, I was talking with a group of friends from North Minneapolis, and they said they're sad when they drive by Cedarworth Park and the new Lca building. And they're sad because it used to be a space that they felt like they and their families could go to, and now it's a space that's just been overtaken by people that aren't connected to the community. And it's a sadness. So they avoid driving past it. Those kinds of things, research is not going to give us, but it is a reality of how people are mourning changes to space that they feel like they don't have a voice or a say in, and no choice if financially they don't have the power comparatively to another group who has the power financially to come in and has more freedom to do things. And I have heard stories like that up and down Franklin and in other parts of St. Paul. And I just think that there's something there that I really hope that we include and value to the same degree we do other pieces of information, because I think that's really the heart of what displacement and gentrification, when we aren't thoughtful about it, really is problematic for our communities going forward, and has been historically, of course. That's it. I'm gonna be quiet. You know what I'm looking for.
Thank you, Councilmember. Yep, very clear, and we appreciate it. I think to Ms. Beard's point, we have to figure out how to do just that, how to measure, score what those impacts might be, and we're not there yet. So thank you for your input. Anything else on the presentation so far, or Ms. Beard, do you want to continue, please?
It looks like Councilmember Chambliss has her hand raised, Chair.
Oh, thank you, Tara. I know it's hard to see everybody when the presentation is up. Yeah, I really appreciated your comments, Linnea. The sense of loss that can happen when your community changes and you no longer feel a part of that change is really important. So I definitely think that the conversations need to be had with the application process, and also outside of the criteria, how we as policymakers can position our work so that displacement doesn't happen. Who do we need to talk to? Is it Metro Cities, the people who are bringing the applications forward? Those are some things that I think the council should be looking at. And then Tara, I know you were on page 13. Did you finish with the representation part?
Thank you, Councilmember. Yes, Mr. Chair, we can move ahead to the next slide if you're ready, if everyone's ready.
Please.
Great. So specifically, some of the changes to the actual equity criteria, that was just sort of a little bit more about where we were organizing, kind of given the new organizational structure, where the equity criterion kind of lived and where it had come from in the old organization. But now want to talk a little bit about some specific changes to the criterion itself. And part of that is right sizing the specificity. There were some examples, and I'm going to share with you where it felt like the criterion was too vague, and then in cases where it was the opposite. There's also some equity criteria that considers community context. There was a lot of work we did with talking to very different types of regions across the community about what does equity look like for a community that is 97% white, for example. How does that community address equity in their application? And so looking at ways to address equity, especially in the project process, given the demographics of that community. And then finally, we're going to propose, or we're recommending, and would love your feedback on creating a minimum bar for equity efforts in projects. So I'm going too much in the weeds already, so instead of just summarizing. So let's move on to the next slide and get into the weeds with the actual right slides. Oh, there's a lot of slides now. Could we be on slide 15, please, Greg? Thanks. So I mentioned level of specificity. So two criteria from last year's scoring criterion include an applicant's policy supporting disadvantaged business enterprises, and that is in the jobs section of the way the scoring was organized in the past, and the acceptance of housing choice vouchers and in the housing section of how the scoring was organized in the past. And really, if we move to the next slide, Greg, please. What I'm proposing and what we're recommending to you today is that those are two examples of a variety of different ways racial equity specifically can be addressed through these programs. And so to not limit that the criterion is will you accept housing choice vouchers or not, but acknowledge that what we're looking for is there a racial equity outcome based on your housing project, right? The project that's bringing new housing units to the region. And that can be measured certainly by accepting, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the jobs one. So speaking, the slides are very similar for housing and jobs. So again, for jobs, the criterion in the past was whether or not the applicant city had disadvantaged business enterprise programs. That is one way to address racial equity via jobs outcomes, and that is still a way that applicant can score points in this process. But there are more than one way. There is more than one way to address racial equity in terms of outcomes via jobs, and the examples on this slide are not exclusive. These are just a sampling of the different ways that we can measure and or ask in an application to understand more the potential impact on equity because of the types of jobs or the location of jobs. Another thing we're trying to do across all of our criteria is make sure that the points are available from a variety of sources. So a developer, for example, can't decide whether or not the community that they're building, they're proposing to build in, has a disadvantaged business enterprise program. But that developer could have their own internal practices or policies. And so just allowing for a little bit more information and context to understand, yes, the role of the applicant city, but also what are the opportunities for the development team that align with our goals that we can reward in the scoring process. And then the next slide, please, Greg, is sort of the same thing, but for housing. Accepting housing choice vouchers is certainly a way to address racial equity outcomes via housing. It's one of many ways, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list below, but it's just an example of some of the many ways we can address racial equity outcomes. I want to reassure y'all that in the scoring criteria, when it goes out, this kind of specificity, in case there's sort of so you're going to put, in the scoring criteria, furthering racial equity outcomes via housing. Well, do folks know what you're expecting to see? That there's a list of things you've already thought of that are kind of what you're trying to look for. And that information will be provided in our program guides. So just because it's not in the scoring criteria, because then our scoring criteria would be a novel, I want to reassure you that this level of kind of specificity and technical assistance is going to be available. Next slide, please. and I believe I'm going to, okay. So then there are some criteria that really felt like it was too vague. And the examples below, the first bullet comes from the TOD scoring criteria last year, and the next one is from the LCDA scoring criteria, but they're both trying to basically say, did you do something, did you provide equitable development strategies? Will your project contribute to equitable outcomes? And we wanted to be more specific in this context and say, how is the project process responsive to racial equity given the context of the project area? And how is your team qualified to address the demographics of the project area? So next slide, please, Greg. So this is kind of how that looks. When we're asking communities, in terms of outreach and engagement, what does that look like for a community that is racially diverse? And what does that look like for a community that's racially pretty homogenous? And so providing kind of a spectrum of points that allows for wherever you kind of are in that spectrum, you can approach your project with affirmative efforts to increase racial diversity in the community, to remove barriers to housing choice in the community. If you're already incredibly diverse, then how did you decide who to engage and who did you engage? And we will, again, absolutely help with technical assistance in terms of providing demographics or information about community organizations if the community doesn't have access to those themselves. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the project team and their reflectiveness and responsiveness to the community, again, in a racially diverse community is at least one project partner racially representative of those least representative, most impacted in that community, in that area. And in a more racially homogenous community is at least one project partner representative of the broader equity community. So, we are, and this is very much in response to feedback from some of you, trying to be really specific and center racial equity, but then other times, acknowledge that this is the broader equity we're talking about, and there may be communities where making sure that people were included that aren't traditionally included, whether maybe they're lower income or whether it's youth maybe, or whether it is folks with disabilities, that some thought was put into the project process to include participation and engagement from those that are often least represented. Next slide, please. And then the last piece of the equity criteria, and then we can take more questions and discussion and hear from Councilmember Chambliss as well, is establishing a baseline. So for those of you, most of you are probably aware that both the LCDA and TOD programs are scored using a two-step process. We score with staff, subject matter experts, we score in the first step, and a minimum score is required to move on to the second step, which is scored by the Livable Communities Advisory Committee. And there's always been a minimum score for the step one process to move forward. What we're proposing for 2021 is a minimum share of equity-derived step one points also being required to advance to step two review. So in the example of the Livable Communities Demonstration Account, there are 16 equity-derived points in step one. We would propose that a minimum of 10 of those 16 points be achieved to be able to move into step two. And so that's sort of making sure that that came from a lot of different feedback from members of LCAC to council members to staff, to really make sure that we have we kind of have a break, like a handbrake, for a project that may be hitting all the right notes, but it really didn't do its job and didn't meet our standards for considering equity and equitable outcomes in growth and development. And there were a couple projects this year where it was like, we're scoring, they're landing here, but I really don't feel like they did what they could, how they did what they could have to engage the community and reach out. And I can think of two other organizations right in their backyard that they could have reached out to and things like that. So, so I do think that could be a really impactful way to ensure that kind of a minimum bar is being met for project processes to address equity. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Councilmember Chambliss.
Okay, we are on, I'm getting my page here. Changes. Let me get to the right page here.
22, I believe.
Basically, I don't have a presentation for page 22, but we do have a break point here where we can ask council members if they have any questions or feedback, because that's kind of been a lot. We've condensed a lot of information.
Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you. And Tara, I think this might be appropriate to just mention here too, as the program comes together, there will be a booklet or a guidebook or a guide program around all of this with the definitions and helping the applicants understand, each one of these pieces more robustly, so that as they assemble our applications, we're trying to meet expectations too and drive them to push on, what we're really looking for in these applications as we work to meet the state statutes, and then B, achieve our goals. So, I think it's really important too, where, it's a lot to digest in one night, but as it all really comes together, the applicants, the cities and their partners, this is going to be a change, but I know there will be a lot of, meetings, workshopping, getting the definitions, getting it all out there. So again, it's not just an abrupt, things have changed. What are they doing? We don't understand this. And we miss a bunch of people. So kudos to staff for thinking about that too, as part of the important process and setting everything up with what we eventually come up with here.
Thank you, Councilmember. Other questions or discussions about the scoring distribution, especially the equity section? Anyone? Hearing none, I'll turn it back to either Ms. Beard or Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I apologize. Councilmember Chambliss, I threw you a slide that was not your slide, so that was my mistake. I apologize for that. But I will take this moment to remind folks that not asking for a recommendation today, or even the next time I return on January 19th to button some of this down. So if in reading, there is so much information we're trying to condense into this presentation and kind of summarize, and it's missing a lot of the weeds. So in those rubrics from your packet, please reach out in the coming weeks, and we can either talk through it directly or propose, potentially propose additional tweaks that we can discuss on the 19th. I believe the next slide. Sorry.
Thank you for that, Ms. Beard. If I can just say, and I'm sure everyone saw it in the chat, but also to ask either you or someone from your team to reach out to Councilmember Wolf, who wants to stay engaged in this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And now I think I'm correct. This slide is Councilmember Chambliss's. If you go to the next slide, Greg, please.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Tara is also going to talk about the staff recommendations for readiness criteria and what came out of the discussions from the housing work group and the other groups that were engaged. We looked at the correlation between the readiness scores and projects actually being completed, and the feedback from the Livable Communities Advisory Committee members on scoring readiness to give a deeper consideration of what we're trying to measure and value in terms of readiness. So readiness between the project, the time between readiness and the project completion and its correlation, and how we're evaluating those projects. Tara, do you have anything to add to that? If not, are there any questions?
Thank you, Councilmember Chambliss. Mr. Chair, if it's okay if we go to the next slide. That's sort of the results of what Councilmember Chambliss just sort of summarized. And so this is using that same format from earlier in the presentation, where we're showing kind of what is criteria from the past that we are continuing to use, what is maybe being dropped, and what is new. So when it comes to readiness. So readiness, we need you to think you can use the grant in 36 months. We need, that's the grant term, and this money is annually levied and annually distributed, and not meant to kind of sit in a bank account. And then the strength of an applicant and development partners partnership is something that I learned from staff is actually one of the strongest indicators of a project success. Most of the, we found a much stronger correlation in relinquishments of grant awards from projects where the partnership wasn't solid than we did from projects that didn't have as much committed funding as others say. So we are proposing to drop the status of funding commitments from the current scoring criteria, as well as the status of regulatory approvals. The city is the applicant, so I would hope that they aren't aren't proposing projects in their community that they would then hold up on a zoning need. And then new in 2021 is really focusing on one other kind of measure we found does actually play a role in a project's readiness and a likeliness to be completed. And that's about local efforts to contribute to the project financially. When the city is committed deeply to the project and will even contribute its own resources towards the project, it's much more likely that even if it maybe didn't get its Minnesota Housing Fund that round that year because it's an affordable housing project, it's not going to go away, and our money can actually really help it stay alive. So then the next slide is the invitation to discuss or ask questions about those readiness changes.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Beard. And I would just add the new criteria in 2021 about the local efforts was an attempt to get at, I think, some of what you were talking about, Councilmember Atlas Engelbretson, but to really put some onus on the applicants, the local community, to engage within the project to make sure that those commitments are in place. And I think the project that we talked about, where we had quite a bit of interaction with the emerging developer in North Minneapolis, that didn't really happen. And so it's very, very, I guess, maybe subtle or very nuanced, but to build into the criteria an expectation that local communities are fully engaged in ensuring that those funding commitments are in place.
And Mr.
Other
Chair,
questions? Yeah, Councilmember Johnson.
And to briefly add on to that, 100% that. And then one of the things too that I hope we can accomplish is that local community also is getting their affordable housing tool belt out and using the tools that they have, right, and not taking a pass on their own tools to the detriment of the overall project funding model. So, there has to be support from their own council to dig into their comp plan and look at that tool belt that they've hopefully laid out quite well. And I think that should be at some point some consideration in this too.
Other questions, discussion about readiness criteria? Yeah, Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, this is not necessarily about the readiness criteria, but because it's come up a couple of times that that we're going to be getting our packets and we're going to have further in-depth discussion, I just wanted to see if Tara can speak to what we're going to be discussing on January 19th, because I think that's where we're going to dig deeper into the actual criteria.
Great. That leads beautifully into the next slide.
It does. Next slide, please, Greg. And I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. May I?
Please. Yeah, please.
And I'm really glad that you brought that up, Councilmember Chambliss, because really for the January 19th meeting, we need to start honing more in on the funding available and deciding if we want to look at supplementing our statutory defined award amounts with any of the reserve funding that we have from projects that have been relinquished or interest earnings and or any additional funds that the council can put towards these projects if they want to. So we do need to start to shift over to the funding conversation, but my intention was definitely based on any questions that came up today, or if in the next week or two, digging into that criteria, there's some things that need to be surfaced or asked that really should be discussed at the committee level, we can absolutely add that to the agenda as well on the 19th.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we anticipating that this is going to be a large chunk of that meeting on the 19th? Because I think we're going to need it. In a good way, right? But I mean, we are, we do our better work near the 4 o'clock part of the meeting than the 7 or 7:30 part of the meeting. As a council member, I've gone past 1 a.m. and we really were horrible at that point. So we don't do that on the council. But I'm just saying, if there's a way to dedicate a huge chunk of that meeting, I think that's good. And as we always do as council members, and it's hard, everybody's busy, but if you get the packet, it's always good to try to pre-ask questions too, and vet some of that, so staff kind of might get a flavor of what we're looking for, and then they can maybe hone in on some of that for the large group meeting. I hope that was okay if I offered that up as kind of something for consideration.
I appreciate it, Councilmember, and I might turn to Director Baraha. She's looking way more forward than I am on upcoming agenda, but I'm sure she's hearing you and taking that to heart. And I agree, this is an important and pithy conversation, especially as we hone in on funding. It's going to get even pithier. So I don't know, Director Barajas, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that comment, Councilmember Johnson. I totally agree with you. And we generally tend to spread out our business as much as we can. And this month of December, though, has been real hard on that. And we definitely apologize for your very long agendas and appreciate you sticking with us in these conversations, as so much of our work has kind of converged at the same time and needing to move forward to meet other deadlines. But certainly our upcoming meetings look a lot less or a lot shorter, I should say, as far as number of items on the agenda, so we can dedicate more time to these conversations.
Thank you. And I think that that was it on this slide, right, Tara? So the next slide
is just thank you.
So so no, huge thanks to you, your team, to Councilmember Chambliss, to the entire work group, and I think it's really helped kind of organize what we're doing. This is kind of the work group's report back out into the committee and then the council, and I think that this has worked well, and I would welcome any comments on either how it hasn't worked or how it has. So any further comments, questions, discussion?
If I may briefly, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I have to take a moment to acknowledge my staff. There isn't a single recommendation here or a single recommendation in the packets and the scoring tables that didn't come from a ton of work and a ton of data analysis and going back through old applications and really noodling over this stuff. And the LCA team are all just brilliant, really amazing colleagues, and all this work represents help from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Beard, and thanks to your staff. And it's just been amazing to watch them up close in the housing work group and watching incredible work. And I'll just remind us that this is probably one of the most significant reviews of the scoring criteria since the program has been put in place. So we have rich data, and now thanks to you, Tara, and your staff's work, your team's work, we can use that. So well done. Any further discussion?
I just wanted to say, Chair Lilligren, that I intentionally wanted to talk as little as possible during this presentation because I wanted this to be looked at as something that the work group put together, as well as all of the staff and Tara and her expertise. So I want to thank you all for what you put together, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this ends up.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any further discussion? Hearing none, Director Barajas will defer the last item then until next year. And seeing no further business before this committee, I just want to thank you for the work this year. It's an honor to work amongst you. Stay safe, stay healthy this holiday season. We'll see you on Wednesday, I suppose, but look forward to working with you all in the new year. And seeing no further business, Director Barajas, were you waving or asking for the floor? Oh, giving a thumbs up. Okay. Great. Seeing no further business before this.
I think our Wednesday meeting is canceled. Am I wrong about that? It is on? Last Wednesday was canceled. Thanks, guys. Okay. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Hey, Michelle, nice seeing you. Happy holidays.
Everybody.
See you soon.
Everybody.
We're adjourned.
Bye-bye.